Every sport has their fair share of athletes that inspire greatness by being great. Arm wrestling is no different in this regard. In this video, we'll take a look at the life stories of these athletes and examine their ups and downs in this still relatively niche sport. So sit back and let me, the arm historian, take you on a trip through the history of these 12 professional arm wrestlers. Without a doubt, one of the most controversial and polarizing figures in arm wrestling, Monster Michael Todd makes the pendulum between beloved and hated swing wildly. In actuality, who is Michael Todd? And through which highs and lows did he become the notorious figure in arm wrestling he is today? I am the arm historian, and in this video we'll explore the rise and fall of Monster Michael Todd. Michael Todd was born on the 12th of June 1973 in Malvern, a small city in the county seat of Hot Spring County, Arkansas, USA. While originally used as a railroad stop, Malvern later became known as the brick capital of the world, when the production of bricks from locally available clay became prominent. Little is known publicly about Michael's early childhood, but according to his own account, he had memories of locals in the mainly working-class city of Malvern, settling debts and testing their strength through arm wrestling. This mindset was confirmed to Michael even further when his father would challenge him to arm wrestling matches to check his developing physical power. It wasn't until years later, after his 15th birthday, he managed to consistently beat his father in arm wrestling. Before dedicating his life fully to arm wrestling though, Michael was enamored with martial arts. First honing his skills in karate, he was later allegedly awarded his black belt in taekwondo. It wasn't until somewhere in 1990, a year before he would graduate high school, Michael came across an advert for a local wrist wrestling tournament at the Saline County Fair. Although the term is sometimes used interchangeably with traditional arm wrestling, wrist wrestling could also refer to a once fairly popular form of arm wrestling that has since fallen into obscurity, where competitors grab each other's non-active hand instead of the now used pegs. Todd would compete in the tournament and receive third place, igniting his passion and eventual obsession with the sport of arm wrestling. In the following couple of years, he would start organizing his own small tournaments at a local boys' club and start focusing on building up his own strength and technique. In 1992, Mike tried his hand at his first major tournament, the US Nationals. After this, he started participating in several professional tournaments throughout the US, while working independently as a body transformation coach. It wasn't until the start of the new millennium that Michael would see his first national title. Being known as a quick and tenacious shoulder presser, Michael further developed his technique, training his strength and eventually winning several national and regional titles throughout the next decade. By the time 2007 rolls around, Mike is making a name for himself in Neil Pickup's Arm Wars series, and for the first time showing more of his personality and mindset to the arm wrestling world. Michael appears superficially confident and relatively combative on the table. Because of this and his big stature, Michael is baptized Monster by the high priest of arm wrestling nicknames, Neil Pickup. Around 2011, while still working as a personal trainer and body transformation coach, Mike meets a woman named Rebecca. While originally a student of his, the two hit it off and develop what is by all accounts a whirlwind romance, eventually tying the knot 3 years on in 2014. Rebecca would end up playing a big role in Michael's public persona, as well as his arm wrestling career. Several years on, we start to see Michael utilizing more of an open style of arm wrestling, often dropping into an open arm top roll or a full-on King's move. Partly because of the relatively lenient Arm Wars rules, Monster Michael Todd found a lot of success with this style, allowing him to drop low under the table, his humerus bone sometimes in a declined angle, all the while trying to keep his hand and pronation somewhat engaged. Michael would later say he mainly deployed this tactic because of damage to his hand, wrist, and multiple fractures in his arm. Indeed, one can notice how by this time, his elbow joint is developing a lock at an angle, essentially making it impossible to straighten out completely. Although drawing out a fair amount of criticism and controversy in the then relatively popular arm wrestling forums, It isn't until the rise of social media and arm wrestling on YouTube when the floodgates are truly opened, with him receiving comments condemning his King's move as not real arm wrestling and all-around cheating. Around this time, the monster would earn a second nickname, although now less pleasing to Michael and his ever-growing, seemingly somewhat fragile ego. Michael Under the Table Todd was born, a moniker that he continues to struggle with and that follows him until this day. Around the middle of the last decade, a new beast reared its head in the arm wrestling tournament scene. The World Arm Wrestling League, or WAL, was born, and with it came a whole new wave of potential fans and scrutiny. Much like its older brother Arm Wars, WAL came in with loose rules, running fouls, and added bigger elbow pads. These factors arguably played to Michael's advantage, allowing him to dip deeper below the table in his King's move and extending how far back he could drag his elbow. On the bright side, this opened the door for Michael to do really well at this league, after which he earned several champion titles over the next few years and a few very notable wins. On the flip side though, the spotlight that was now pointed directly on Michael invited more critics and eyes on his arm wrestling, as well as his often brazen personality on the table. When interviewed after the matches, Michael appeared mostly emotional and focused some of his attention on the love he shares with his wife, Rebecca. This sudden switch from combative and righteous down to downtrodden and slightly emotional would become a hallmark of the arm wrestler's career. One of the best known and controversial examples of this was in the seemingly never-ending match between him and Jerry Caderet in the WAL 506 title match. Throughout this grueling match, Mike starts talking to his wife, telling her he injured his arm and generally upping the dramatics to a maximum. When the last round ends with the strap coming loose, the ref calls for a restart. Michael, seemingly fueled by adrenaline and what is in his eyes an unjust call, starts demanding he be granted the win. Whether or not he should have been granted the win is certainly up for debate, but I think the more interesting thing in this interaction is Michael's slightly unhinged behavior and the stark contrast between him and Jerry Caderet in this moment. Unlike Jerry, who puts in his 2 cents and eventually relents to Michael in the ref's call, Mike, seemingly reinforced by Rebecca, is completely unwilling to give in and restart the match. Ultimately, the monster is granted the hammer and title, and the match is declared over. Not long before this match, around 2018, Michael started to post more on social media, uploading sporadic exercise and match videos on YouTube. While having some success here with quite a bit of fans gaining an insight into his personal life and being exposed to more of Michael's personality, it also meant he was exposed to a larger number of comments by people who were, to say the least, very critical of his arm wrestling style. This certainly did not improve throughout the next couple of years. The world became engulfed in one of the biggest pandemics of the modern age, and arm wrestling wasn't spared, with several leagues cancelling their events. Although one would at first expect this to be a huge detriment to the growth and evolution of the sport, exactly the opposite happened. Arm wrestling saw a boom in popularity like never before. While this subject deserves a video of its own, it's safe to say the introduction of new voices on various social media channels, and people having more free time to discover old and recent arm wrestling matches, played a big role. Once again, considering all ships rise with the tide, this brought an as of yet unseen amount of attention and scrutiny to Michael Todd. Instead of ignoring many of the negative comments, Michael, as well as Rebecca to an extent, started rebutting and frequently addressing the negative attention. Perhaps partly to grow his channel and online notoriety, but certainly also because of an unrelenting will to prove himself in the right and painting his retractors as simple haters who stand in the way on his road to becoming the best ever. With Levon clearly emerging as the undisputed number 1 during this time, Michael's ultimate goal became clear. With many recognizing Michael as a number 2, or at least a serious contender, it seemed this clash of titans was inevitable. When a match with the Georgian Hulk was not readily available within a short amount of time, Michael decided to organize a little refresher match. Devon Larratt. With Larratt recovering from serious health issues, Michael saw this as an opportunity to score a quick win in a conventional style, perhaps in a bid to win back some goodwill from the arm wrestling public. In the lead up to the match, Mike looked to be in tip-top shape and touted to be the strongest he has ever been. For those reasons, a lot of fans picked Mike as the clear favorite. Come the week of the match, however, it soon became apparent that Devon likewise showed up in never-before-seen form, seemingly packing a large amount of mass and fully recovered. While Mike showed some vitriol and fighting spirit in the very early stages of the match, Devon dominated and overpowered Michael easily during the rest of the match. At a certain point, Mike seems to have accepted his inevitable defeat and even asked Devon to please not hurt him. After the match, Mike appears gracious in defeat, reiterates that he is in the best shape he has ever been, and proclaims that Devon was clearly the better man that day. Not long after, though, when talking about the match, Michael insinuates that not everything was as it seemed, later going into detail over how he wasn't feeling like himself when he returned home and was considerably weaker than he originally espoused. This pattern of Michael claiming to be a bigger, better version of himself in the follow-up to a match, to then losing the match and later laying claim to any possible excuse, quickly became a mainstay, sometimes going as far as not even recognizing the match result and proclaiming himself as a true winner after the facts. A prime example of this came after one of his recent losses against the Georgian giant, Revaz Lutidze. The match was a real grinder and in my opinion a treat to watch. Even though Mike lost, it would have been a great opportunity for him to be humble, recognize Revaz as a great arm wrestler, and look at why he lost as a learning experience. Instead, Michael decides to blame the referees and uptalk his own strength and arm wrestling prowess at every opportunity after the match. After this, he vows to come back as whichever version of the monster we are currently at, and the cycle continues. During the last couple of years, Michael decided to start a venture in the tournament organizing scene by organizing the Monster Factory, a series of super matches with prominent and less popular names out of the US arm wrestling scene. While I see this as a mostly positive evolution and appreciate the effort that goes into creating something like this, Michael and Rebecca being at the helm here didn't exactly leave it free of controversy. Because of Michael and in the latest edition even Rebecca pulling in the tournament, as well as some of their close friends and themselves also commentating the event, it seems a lot of people took issue with impartialness. The announcers and organizers would often be actively rooting for certain competitors over others, and sometimes even find their way on stage, seemingly intervening at key points in the match. While this is certainly not unique to Michael as an organizer, the small scale of the venue and to a certain degree the tournament made it all the more blatant. Another point of contention were some of the sponsors the Monster Factory chose to work with. A certain company that was heavily shown off at the latest edition of the tournament holds very dubious claims about their efficacy and overall product. If one were to look into what this company really sold and how little scientific groundwork has been done to validate these products and services, this choice of sponsor could be worth questioning at the very least. In the end, I see Monster Michael Todd as an endlessly fascinating, but ultimately tragic character within the arm wrestling world. He seems to possess the uncanny ability to be at the same time very affected by all the criticism, but also totally unwilling to accept any validity or opportunities for self-reflection from it, often putting up a shield of faux humility, quickly followed by singing his own praises. And while I certainly appreciate the unrelenting nature Michael brings to the table and all he has done to help grow the sport, I can't help but look forward to the next oxymoronic Monster Todd statement we can collectively discuss. Perhaps best summarizing this video and Michael as an arm wrestler in my view is a very telling quote in his own words. I did not have any trophies because I did not play any team sports. So, if I went to my friend's house and he had a big trophy shelf, I did not have that. I kept every trophy I have won for the last 32 years. I love this sport. Arguably one of the most recognizable arm wrestlers of the last 2 decades, the infamous Travis Bagent is not known for his serenity on the table, but rather for his seemingly unwavering confidence and unwillingness to compromise or self-censor. Of course, with such levels of boldness, this once illustrious arm wrestler is known to attract praise as well as his fair share of controversy. But in reality, who is Travis Bagent, and through which highs and lows did he become the figure he is now? With his presence imminent at the next edition of East vs. West, it seems like a suitable time to gently guide the bright spotlight of arm history in his direction. I am the Arm Historian, and today we'll take a look together at the rise and fall of Travis Bagent. Travis Bagent was welcomed to the world on the 10th of March, 1976 in Charlestown, West Virginia, a small city located not far from Washington, D.C., with a rich history. The city was originally founded and subsequently named by the brother of George Washington, Charles, and is now known to have a sparse suburban feel. Travis can genuinely lay claim to being raised from a young age in and around arm wrestling. His father, Jerry Boyd, also known as Big Arm, first found out about competitive arm wrestling during his time in the Navy in the 1960s, and quickly rose to local renown as a ferocious arm wrestler back in Charlestown. Travis first became enamored with sports by playing baseball. He quickly found out he had some athletic talents, as he excelled quite well at the sport as an early teen. Later during Travis's teenage years, in 1990, Jerry Boyd went on to open a bar in Charlestown. He made it into somewhat of a haven for local arm wrestlers. Matches would be going on nearly every day in the bar between patrons, and eventually proper regulation tables were even brought in. It wasn't until Travis was 15 that he first started arm wrestling. He could oftentimes be found arm wrestling in between bussing tables and serving drinks, as by this time he was working during weekends at his dad's bar. Some bigger names in the arm wrestling world would even frequent his bar, one of them being Ray Patton, brother of the legendary arm wrestler Dave Patton, whose record in the 80s was arguably only second to John Brezink. Ray, who was an accomplished arm wrestler in his own right, together with several other notables from the local arm wrestling scene, must have had a big influence on the young developing Travis Bagent. Jerry Boyd eventually even set up a second bar in town named Billy Jack's, which would also become known as somewhat of a hotspot for arm wrestling. Travis would later go on to say the following about this period in his life. Few people have a situation like mine, a place where there are 10 tables and 400 to 600 competitors every Friday, Saturday and Sunday, and I cared desperately about finding someone in there that I could beat. I didn't stop until I did, and one thing I had the ability to do was beat people who were stronger than me. I don't think most people get that. Travis's father was mostly known for his quick and strong hits, something that he would stress is critically important to winning. This mentality seems to have rubbed off on Travis, as he developed a quick, strong hit, with loads of posting and side pressure as arguably one of his best moves. Bagent first decided to compete in an official tournament in 1997 in Pennsylvania at the age of 21, in which by his account he lost to everyone. I think it's worth mentioning though that there are some conflicting reports on this. Another source tells the story differently, where Travis participated in his first national tournament at the age of 19. Whatever the case may be, it soon became very clear that Travis had an incredible knack for the sport and could quite easily become a serious contender on the national and even world stage. During the following years, Travis would get heavily involved in CrossFit. This fledgling fitness regimen was conceived at the start of the millennium and involves constantly varied functional movements performed at a high intensity. These features obviously played into Travis's natural strong suits, which allowed him to build a career as a trainer as well as enhance his own strengths. In parallel, his trajectory on the arm wrestling table was facing a steep incline too. Travis went on to win several national and world titles, and consistently came out as the top of the pack in other high-profile tournaments. While mostly respectful and loudly confident during this time, some first signs of Travis's no-holds-barred attitude and generally taunting demeanor were starting to develop and being exposed to the public. Around 2004, Travis was focusing most of his efforts in the gym, lifting weights, doing CrossFit and training his grip strength, with table practice playing second fiddle. In interviews at the time, he would recommend newcomers to the sport to get strong first, then learn to arm wrestle. He continued, You can only trick people for so long. To reach the top, you need power. With this mindset, Travis seemed to rise to new heights within the arm wrestling world, and was soon considered one of the best to do it, especially if you put any stock in his opinion about himself. His prominence reached the ears of Sevan Matosian, a filmmaker of Armenian descent, who was looking to make a documentary about arm wrestling. Specifically, he wanted to hone in and show the narrative of two young up-and-comers in the sport who were trying to dethrone the then dominant John Brezink. This documentary, later dubbed Pulling John, would go on to feature Alexey Voevoda, a 23-year-old Russian, and Travis Bagent, who was around 28 years old at the time. I won't spoil too much of this film because it is definitely worth your time to watch it, but I do think it shows some invaluable insights into the mentality of Travis at that time and his life growing up. When visiting his childhood home and family members in the documentary, Travis opens up about growing up without a lot of money and how he couldn't even afford to take regular showers as a child. He arrives at his family's residence with his usual bravado and exuberance, only to be quickly taken a peg or two down by everyone in attendance. At first glance, these comments from his family members might come off as derogatory towards Travis, perhaps fueled by jealousy, generally putting Travis and his accomplishments in the arm wrestling world down. This might have even been magnified slightly by the presence of a camera crew and some smart edits on the documentary's part. However, it becomes apparent quickly that there is at least some genuine love and support for Travis in his ancestral home, as one of his family members embraces him and asks him to come over more often and bring his wife sometime. In the climax of Pulling John, Travis finds himself competing at a World Championship tournament in Ottawa, Canada. Although his usual antics, confidence and loud voice were on full display that day, there were a few more nuanced, quiet telling moments too. One of them being Travis taking some advice from a very young Engin Terzi, the man now responsible for organizing one of the biggest leagues in arm wrestling. At another point, a very young and thin-looking Neil Pickup, famous announcer and father of Arm Wars, speaks on Travis's rising star and power. During the filming of Pulling John, Travis was even invited to feature on the David Letterman show in an exhibition match. By the following years, Travis became known as one of, if not the best left-handed puller in the world, and a serious elite contender on the right. He dominated a lot of large North American tournaments, and did very well on the international circuit. This success made sure he came back under the watchful eye of the organizer of a fledgling arm wrestling league. Neil Pickup saw in Travis an entertaining and very skilled puller and wanted him for Arm Wars. Featuring so prominently on Arm Wars in the next years meant Travis was exposed to a larger number of people from a bigger region in the world. While obviously very competent on the table, his brazen character was on full display. Oftentimes this made for entertaining and highly contested matches. Travis was clearly naturally charismatic and played well on screen. In some cases though, his complete unwillingness to give an inch to his opponent made for some one-sided and generally non-matches that would more often than not end in fouls. Perhaps no match features this better than when the unstoppable force that is Travis Bagent met the immovable object that is Devin Lorette on the table. When these two competitors would grip up at Arm Wars, one was sure to be in for a show. A rivalry had been brewing between the two rising heavyweight stars of the sport, and neither of them would ever back down. After enduring his success in Arm Wars, Travis would participate relatively often in international tournaments, making it to the top ranks at the Zloty Tour and Nemerov Cup, amongst others. By doing this, he solidified himself as a true world-level contender even more and dispelled rumors that the North American field was generally a lot softer. Travis's international escapades weren't all positive though, perhaps because of his in-your-face personality combined with a difference in cultural perception led to some broken relationships with the Eastern arm wrestling world. While we can only speculate on the true nature of these issues, it seems Travis would find himself snubbed by one of the biggest tournament organizers of the region. In 2014, Travis played a pivotal role in seeing the arm wrestling reality show Game of Arms becoming realized. He served in an advisory function and starred heavily in the now defunct show. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, let me refer you to my previous video, which covers the topic of Game of Arms. After the show ended, Travis kept a close connection and bond with one of the producers. Steve Kaplan, who went on to create the World Arm Wrestling League, saw in Travis an invaluable asset to help him out behind the scenes and pulling the event as a big draw to the show. Travis went on to do very well for himself at Wall, becoming multiple heavyweight champion on the left as well as on the right, beating many notables along the way. Invariably, Travis was still a skilled and powerful arm wrestler who has proven on many occasions to be capable of pulling the best. However, his no-nonsense and win-at-every-cost attitude has led the arm wrestler to his fair share of controversy. A prime example of this came at the Wall final event of 2017, where Travis was facing off against the infamous Michael Todd. In the middle of a round, Travis can be seen leaning forward, his elbow coming off the pads and pushing forward, seemingly in an attempt to re-grip, but putting Todd in a clear break arm position. Surprisingly, the backlash from the public was mostly directed at Michael for his angry outburst after the fact. Even Devin Leratt, present in the crowd, seems incredulous after what just happened and the ensuing ref's call. Another arm wrestler and YouTube influencer recently got into hot water for performing a very similar, although perhaps slightly more extreme move. Maybe by facing a controversial figure in Michael Todd, Travis was able to more easily play his misstep off as Todd simply exaggerating. As a pretty ironic side note, Travis would years later referee a match where something similar happened. Around this time, Travis seemingly ended his long-lasting ties with Wall overnight. According to a reliable source, the main issue arose over contract disputes. Allegedly, Travis was under a strict 7 years exclusive contract with Wall. Maybe he was sensing the inevitable downfall of the league and wanted to get out before its collapse. Or maybe he was seeing the booming popularity of arm wrestling and wanted to be able to cash in on the rising hype. Either way, the contract got in the way of his goals. In the ensuing years, most was quiet on the Travis front, especially when it came to arm wrestling and actual table time. Videos on Travis actually pulling anyone of note around this time are few and far between. In reality, Travis was devoting a large amount of his time to his family life, especially in seeing his son develop into a great athlete in his own right. He did occasionally appear in some legacy matches and in a reffing capacity though. Around the time COVID hit, it seems Travis was spurred on to try his hand at social media and dove headfirst again into the arm wrestling scene. He went on to feature in many interviews with online arm wrestling personalities, coming off as generally knowledgeable, quick-witted, but anything but humble. One seemingly major misstep was when Travis Bagent teamed up with Michael Todd to produce a video and live stream in a bid to promote their YouTube channel. Each of them had announced they would face each other in a battle. By saying this, they of course heavily implied that a super match between the two heavyweights would ensue. When the big day came, however, Travis and Michael can be seen posturing on the table a while, and eventually admitting that the would-be match was a farce. Instead, Travis explained that the battle they alluded to was only a friendly competition to see who could score the highest on a local arcade boxing machine. Many fans, some of whom undoubtedly set time aside in their schedule to watch the match, and in some cases even sent super chats to support their athlete, were understandably disappointed. The issue never really got addressed by Travis, and remnants of it can now only be found in the videos of arm wrestling YouTube channels that had covered the lead-up and aftermath of this debacle at the time. He later teamed up with the dawn of arm wrestling on YouTube, Paul Italia, and several other contacts he had built up over the course of his career to create several arm wrestling events. These events were generally received positively and provided some exciting entertainment. In interviews during this time, Travis reiterates how at the end of the day, his main motivation is the potential financial gain. While one can hardly blame anyone for wanting to make a living, by this time one could consider it a defining theme behind Travis's motivations in the sport. While still exuding the same self-confidence as ever, Travis decided to try his hand at professional arm wrestling one more time. Perhaps fueled by the prospect of a rapidly growing sport and all the possible financial benefits that came with it, he organized what in his eyes would be a good refresher match between himself and the young up-and-comer Brandon Alcesser. When the match took place, it soon became apparent that the power and hand control Travis had cultivated over all these years in the sport was still there initially, but faded rather quickly. He lost a super match to Alcesser in a dramatic fashion after seemingly gassing out after the initial rounds. This result was not that surprising, as Travis hadn't prepped much for the match and was until that time by all accounts not arm wrestling at a professional level anymore. In more recent years, Travis teamed up with Floridian arm wrestler Artem Taranenko in producing a podcast. While episode releases of the podcast are now sporadic at best, the show garnered a modest interest and put Travis on the map in the YouTube world as an active participant even more. In another recent twist, Engin revealed he wants Travis to participate in the upcoming East vs West 6 event. I highly doubt Travis will be showing up to pull anyone other than an exhibition match at best. It would be very exciting to see him show up as an announcer or even referee. In the end, I consider Travis the Beast Bagent to be a cornerstone of the modern arm wrestling era, albeit one with rough edges. Clearly someone who doesn't mind playing the heel and who isn't afraid to use what some would consider dirty tactics in order to reach victory. He came from humble beginnings and paved a path for himself, perhaps to a fault without compromise. Although I occasionally appreciate but don't always agree with his tactics, motives, and sometimes downright crude demeanor.
Fucking
I genuinely hope he will see Travis utilize his current momentum and solidify himself once again as an unmistakable part of contemporary arm wrestling culture. That Travis Bagent sure is one crazy dude, isn't he? Talking about crazy dudes, you'd be crazy not to hit that like button. And here's Mr. Voevoda. Once an unmistakable icon representing arm wrestling and strength in the East, Alexey Voevoda might conjure up thoughts of heavy training sessions in a rudimentary gym basement, yet despite his meteoric rise to the highest echelons of the arm wrestling world, he seems to have disappeared from the scene just as quickly. In reality, where is this fearless athlete now, and how did he become the figure he is today? With his comeback seemingly inevitable, it seems like the proper time to take a closer look. I am the Arm Historian, and today, join me in examining the rise and fall of Alexey Voevoda. While details about the childhoods of notorious arm wrestlers are never plentiful, Alexey's early years seem to be mired in fantastical tales of strength and combat prowess, approaching nearly folkloric proportions. Alexey Ivanovich Voevoda was born on the 9th of May 1980 in Kalibovica, Chernihiv Oblast, in the then Soviet-controlled Ukraine. If the man's own account is something to go by, he claims his ancestors to be legendary Russian military commanders, who used arm wrestling as a method to decide on which amongst their ranks were the best soldiers. His grandfather is said to have been a local hero who in his free time ran faster than cars, lifted the then omnipresent Saporafets with one hand, and was known from time to time to bend nickels with his fingers. This must have left a big impression on young Alexey when he would spend long summers with his grandparents, living on their farm in between the mountains. When he went out to play with the local children, they would often climb up trees as fast as possible, an endeavor where he would already excel at compared to his peers. Alexey's father, Ivan Voevoda, was a master of sports in wrestling and all forms of martial arts. At a very young age, Alexey, under the guidance of his father, would start practicing every matter of sports, including karate, wrestling, and taekwondo, something that arguably laid the foundation for his love affair with combat sports. At age 14, Alexey had seemingly progressed tremendously, as it's reported he could turn over cars by himself and jump clean over a desk. Sometime during Alexey's early childhood years, his father, a party worker, was transferred to Russia proper and seems to have moved his family to Sochi, a well-known and popular holiday destination on the coast of the Black Sea. It is there where Alexey would first learn about the existence of arm wrestling. The Iron Hand, a local arm wrestling event, was held in Sochi and caught the eye of the young Alexey Voevoda. While at first not too eager to enter a competition in something he had little experience in, his friends would spur him on to participate and even financially provided for the entry fees to the tournament. The actual results and Alexey's placement in the tournament has been lost to time. However, it seems like he did quite well, as he caught the attention of an infamous arm wrestling coach of the region, Kote Razmadze. This infamous coach, who would go on to train with the likes of Denis Siplenkov, saw in Alexey a young natural power and someone who possessed a great instinct for the sport. Alexey would eventually enroll and graduate at a local university and get his degree in tourism and recreation. His real dream, however, was to be allowed to enter the prestigious Higher Police School, located in Rostov-on-Don. Unfortunately, the physical education exams proved to be too much for Alexey, getting him rejected from the institution. Perhaps this granted the young Russian athlete the time and motivation to dedicate himself to arm wrestling fully. During the next few years, Alexey would develop his strength and technique on the table further. Under the tutelage of Razmadze, he found success in local tournaments and after that became known on the international scene as a strong, extremely quick arm wrestler. Alexey went on to compete in the Arm Wrestling World Championships in Finland 3 times over, securing a victory in each one. One day, as Razmadze would later recount, young Alexey consulted him about an invitation he received to attend a tournament in Poland. The organizer of the tournament, Igor Mazurenko, who had dubbed this fledgling tournament the Zloty Tour Cup, wanted a young prospect to attend. At the time, Razmadze dismissed the tournament as not serious, an opinion he would soon after come to change. Despite his trainer's original misgivings, Alexey decided to try his hand at competing in the Zloty Tour and did quite well for himself. In his first outing, he lost in the open weight class to the supremely strong middleweight Svetan Gashevsky. Alexey would later go on to say this loss taught him the important lesson of never underestimating an opponent just because he's lighter. Indeed, he went on to dominate the next 2 editions and seemed poised to win the following edition in 2004. One notable loss in Alexey's career came at the hands of Travis Bagent in the 2003 Ottawa World Championships. A loss he would soon avenge. In the run-up to the 2004 Nemerov Cup, Alexey was approached by a filmmaker of Armenian descent who was making a documentary about 2 arm wrestlers from opposite sides of the world, vying to dethrone the then dominant John Brzezinski. Since the Zloty Tour Cup had secured a lucrative sponsorship deal with vodka brand Nemerov, it would also go by the name Nemerov Cup. This partnership allowed the tournament to expand and invite international athletes. Amongst those athletes were John Brzezinski and Travis Bagent, who together with Voevoda would serve as the protagonists to the aforementioned documentary, aptly named Pulling John. The Nemerov Cup was to serve as a final battleground and climax to the film. In the end, Alexey pulled off a decisive victory and cemented himself as one of, if not the best arm wrestler in the world at the time. One day, while trying to locate a tiny article about one of his arm wrestling victories in the newspaper, he noticed that nearly the entire space in the sports section was occupied by the recent success of the country's bobsledding team. He had never paid much attention to the sport, but came to realize it was rapidly gaining popularity, perhaps due to its inclusion as an Olympic sport. Bobsledding had been an Olympic discipline in nearly every Winter Games since the early 1920s and was at that time booming in popularity in Russia. The sport involves 2 to 4 people pushing a sleigh as fast as they can down an icy track, after which they collectively jump aboard and try to set the best time on a downhill racetrack. Alexey later reflected on how the difference in size between his arm wrestling article and the bobsledding article in the newspaper was so large, he felt immediately attracted to the Olympic sport. He promptly applied to the national team tryouts and found the sport to come rather naturally to him. His overall strength, conditioning and strong arms made him an ideal candidate for the team, as bobsledding demands a great deal of pushing power. Indeed, he soon rose to the top of the trial candidates and promptly made it on the national team, after which Alexey started training rigorously for bobsledding and participating in several competitions. Due to the rather involved training schedule and the upcoming Winter Olympic Games, Alexey's focus on arm wrestling waned. During a fateful bobsledding competition in Canada, Alexey's trademark long hair came unstuck from his helmet and nearly cost the athlete a dramatic accident. Since then, he decided to keep his hair cut short when participating in bobsledding. His hard training seemed to have paid off as he soon participated and won silver in the 2006 Winter Olympics in Turin, lifting Alexey to the ranks of elite world athletes. It looks like the Olympic medal winner could not fully let go of arm wrestling, as only a year on, Alexey decided to announce his comeback. The PAL decided to organize a 6-round super match, with as his opponent the then rising arm wrestling star, Monster Michael Todd. On the day of the matchup, Michael Todd arrived, expecting to come across a rusty Voevoda, who has been out of the sport for several years. What he encountered next, however, was a 125kg chiseled Voevoda, who was as lethal and robotically precise on the table as ever. The 6-round match features Michael trying different angles of attack, with Alexey comfortably holding him, and finishing with a clean top roll every time. This is unfortunately where Alexey's initial comeback to arm wrestling stopped, although there seems to have been some activity in the sport locally and he still maintained some form of table time. Alexey would once again focus on his career in bobsledding. In the Winter Olympics of 2010 in Vancouver, Alexey once again proudly represented his country, this time in the 2-person race. He had as a partner the experienced Alexander Zubkov, someone he had previously raced with on a 4-man team in the 2006 Olympics. The pair seemed like a good match and they secured another medal for Russia, this time bronze. Upon returning from Canada, Alexey publicly announced his retirement from the sport of bobsledding. Once again, years later, he would be persuaded to return to arm wrestling. As the Professional Arm Wrestling League once again was looking to set a match for the grand comeback of Alexey Voevoda in 2014, it seems a pattern was starting to form in the puller's career. This time, however, a different opponent was selected to face the by then Russian legend. Tim Bresnan had received wind of Alexey's imminent comeback and was hounding the league to set up the match. The PAL eventually relented and saw in Tim Bresnan a doable matchup for Alexey. Despite his years of inactivity in arm wrestling, Alexey was still in peak condition, although slightly less bulky and seemingly having lost some of his speed. The match proved to be quite contested, with Tim Bresnan edging out a win with a 4-1 record. The American often was put in less than favorable positions by Alexey, but could every time dig his way out of it and drag Alexey open to the losing side. Maybe slightly tilted by his loss to the older American and his unhappiness with certain calls during the match, Alexey seemed to once again retreat from arm wrestling in a professional capacity. Despite having left arm wrestling, Alexey did not avoid the spotlight or tempered his ambitions in other facets of his life. He was recognized with multiple awards and titles by the state of Russia and began taking a more active role in the goings-on of the region he had come to call home. When it was announced that 2014 Winter Olympics were to take place in Alexey's beloved hometown of Sochi, it seemed only natural that the by then honorary citizen of Sochi would become part of the ambassadors team. Upon seeing the high-octane racetracks of bobsledding once again, it appears Alexey became more than a little tempted to get involved more deeply. A month before the games were to commence, Alexey Voevoda's return to bobsledding was announced. Perhaps seeking glory in his hometown, or maybe spurred on by a call from above in the state machine, Alexey donned his spiked shoes and white helmet yet again. He would be part of a 2-man team with former slaying partner Alexander Zubkov, and also participate as part of a 4-man team. In both instances, Voevoda and his team would go on to win gold medals with stellar performances. However, soon a dark cloud loomed over Alexey's performance in the 2014 Olympics, as well as the entire Russian competitive sporting world. A documentary was released in Germany that alleged the existence of a state-sponsored doping program within Russia's sporting governing body, dating back to at least 2012. An independent commission of the World Anti-Doping Agency was immediately assembled, and a thorough investigation into the allegations were carried out. In the report, the commission came to the conclusion that a deeply rooted culture of cheating had taken hold. It implicated numerous athletes, coaches, trainers, doctors, and big Russian sporting institutions in a state-sponsored doping scheme. The report even alleged members of the Russian Secret Service impersonated lab engineers at the 2014 Sochi Olympics and intimidated lab workers to cover up positive drug test results. Moreover, several athletes were said to have used alternate identities and false samples. It should be noted, though, that Russian officials have since denied all these claims. The World Anti-Doping Agency went on to impose punishments on Russia and Russian athletes. One of the athletes implicated in the scandal was none other than Alexey Voevoda. Alexey originally received a lifetime ban based on his alleged use of doping in the Sochi 2014 Olympics, and his medals were immediately retracted. When Alexey was asked to return the medals, his reply would be swift and arguably impudent. "Come here to me, to my motherland, and try to take my medals away." In the lead-up to the investigations, Alexey used his quite formidable political power to oppose it, painting it off as a plot targeting only Russians, and in general a witch hunt. Although Alexander Zubkov would later come to speak on their transgressions, Alexey would remain steadfast in his innocence. Because of a close relationship between the Olympic Committee and several arm wrestling organizations of the region, Alexey would also be banned from competing in arm wrestling in these specific tournaments. Although why this would have prevented the athlete from competing in other tournaments remains a mystery to me. Several years later, sanctions for some athletes would be shortened to only last until the next Olympic Games, as was the suspension of Alexey. Eventually, Alexey climbed the ranks and worked his way up to serve as a deputy in the State Duma, which is the lower house of the Federal Assembly of Russia. He was a member of the United Russia Party and was also a member of the United Russia faction and the Committee on Ecology and Environmental Protection. This position was perhaps not surprising for people familiar with Alexey's personal beliefs and opinions regarding conservationism. By this time, Alexey was a staunch vegetarian, an animal rights spokesperson, and even attributed a large part of his power to his meatless diet. After several years, he became fully vegan. With Alexey's rise in the political field and his many accomplishments in the sporting world, came a before-unseen amount of attention from the Russian media and public. Instead of shying away from the spotlight, however, Alexey would seem to fully embrace it and even revel in it. While taking a slight jab at the athlete's lack of wife and children, Alexey was offered the lead role of Suave Bachelor in the Russian version of the popular reality show The Bachelor. In the lead-up to the elections, he also participated in the show I Can, in which several competitors tried to amaze a jury with a talent or spectacle. The catch was that contestants would only get a short amount of time, often only days or weeks, to master their stunt. Alexey would learn to play the Jew harp, walk on stilts, sing, and my personal favorite, perform in a circus-like act where he continuously disappears in a giant balloon. In 2020, Alexey participated in the Russian adaptation of Survivor, called The Last Hero. Although not winning the season, he was able to show off some of his physical prowess and remain in the limelight of Russian pop culture. Most recently, Alexey is rumored to commence yet another comeback into the competitive world of arm wrestling. These rumors seem to have originated from the Russian athlete turned political leader himself. Engin Terzi recently even mentioned in a livestream that Alexey will probably be returning to competitive arm wrestling sometime in July of 2023. Whether or not this will happen at East vs West remains unclear. Perhaps if the political turmoil in the region dies down by then, the Russian athlete would be able to compete. I feel like the athlete known as Alexey Voevoda is deserving of a large amount of respect and admiration for his absolute dominance in the arm wrestling world in the years following the turn of the millennium. His role of further popularizing the sport of arm wrestling in the East and even opening the veil between Eastern and Western athletes to an extent cannot be understated. Despite the relatively recent controversy surrounding his career as an Olympic-level bobsledder and his subsequent repeated unwillingness to accept any responsibility, he proved himself as versatile and passionate. Should he choose to return to the world of arm wrestling at large, I for one am sure he would become an invaluable asset to the growth of the sport and would be happy to be among the first to welcome him back. One can only hope that this time he would stay for longer than one match. One of the most outspoken and superficially confrontational arm wrestlers in the arm wrestling world, Rob Vigent Jr. is often touted as one of the most naturally gifted athletes in the sport and seems unafraid to talk about his performance, built on a natural physique. Despite his willingness to project his unfiltered opinions onto everyone willing to listen, how much of it is bark without the proverbial bite? With RVJ's competitive pulling in the scene wavering during the last few years, and a slew of less than fortunate public appearances, it seems like the perfect time to take a closer look at this illustrious puller's career. I am the Arm Historian, and today I'll be your tour guide as we explore the rise and fall of Rob Vigent Jr. Rob Vigent Jr., or RVJ for short, was born sometime shortly after the start of the 1980s, presumably in or somewhere close to Newburyport, Massachusetts in the USA. RVJ grew up in a generally blue-collared, working-class family, and from an early age was exposed to feats of strength in his ancestral home. Rob's grandfather was a Canadian truck driver and farmer who at the age of 50 could do one-armed pull-ups. Rob's father, who according to RVJ was built just like him in a physical sense, worked on a farm and had extremely strong hands, something that was, at least in part, developed by milking cows for hours on end. His uncle would often amaze family members by performing feats of grip strength, one of them being ripping a deck of cards in half with little effort. Since Rob's father would frequent local bars, he could oftentimes be found testing his strength through arm wrestling with fellow laborers at the bar, stories of which must have made an impression on the young RVJ. He would later go on to speak candidly about the impact his father's parenting had on the young boy and man he became.
Because of some of his ways, he was a person you could never get his approval. So I grew up in a kind of like a negative place, always chasing that approval. So for me, it works better that I don't know if I ever got it from him. Like he'll tell his friends and whatnot. I don't know if I ever got any like approval or round of applause or anything like that. So it kept me always in the chase. Mm. So what other people would be happy with was my starting ground for like almost like disgust and annoyance. Like, oh, I got here, but look at all this over here that I could get, you know? Mm-hmm. So it always kept me in that. It's dysfunctional in a way that I've never been happy with anything I've ever achieved because I'm always looking at what I didn't achieve. It's not the 98%, I'm looking at that 2%.
It wasn't until later in grade school, once Rob had some contact with his peers outside of familial circles, that it became clear he stood head and shoulders above the rest in an athletic sense. He would outperform his classmates on the presidential fitness test and was able to do 15 pull-ups at a very young age. Having always been fascinated by raw strength, Rob would eventually come across a website about grip strength. The Grip Board boasted to be the #1 authority on grip strength and had devised a method to test your own grip and rate it on a scale using the now famous grippers. After ordering the implements and trying several levels of them out over the following months and years, Rob had built up and maintained a significantly strong grip, eventually even being recognized by the website. This success prompted him to enter a grip strength tournament, held locally at the time. After this, Rob competed in numerous other grip tournaments and further developed his strength. By the time 2004 rolls around, Rob heard of a big arm wrestling tournament that would take place a 3-hour drive away from him. He would later recall that he was drawn to participate in the tournament because of a childhood memory. At a very young age in the 80s, Rob remembers his cousin, who was 15 years his senior, being involved with strength and arm wrestling. He would regale Rob about stories of him doing really well at qualifiers for what was probably the biggest tournament arm wrestling had ever seen, Over the Top. All these years later, Rob figured he would try his own hand at arm wrestling, seeing as he had always excelled at the casual variation of the sport. Wanting to test his strength, Rob made the 3-hour drive over to the tournament he had heard of. It was to take place in August of 2004 in Vermont, New England. Arriving there, to his surprise, he quickly noticed most competitors were wearing t-shirts with assorted emblems, each representing the arm wrestling club they were a member of. For his first ever opponent in an official tournament, he faced a by then pretty seasoned arm wrestler, Eric Roussin. Rob and Eric ended up having a long, hard-fought hook match in the very first round, but Rob eventually came back to beat Eric in the finals. I spoke with Mr. Roussin about his experience pulling RVJ, and he recalls being surprised at the time, because it was the first time he had lost to a complete unknown in the sport at a competitive level. Rob took first place that day and seemed to be immediately hooked on the sport of arm wrestling. From that day on, he lost interest completely in grip training and decided to focus solely on arm wrestling. Rob would later go on to explain that the thing that attracted him the most about arm wrestling is that you would actually have to face off against ever-changing opponents, which is in stark contrast to the constant battle with numbers as they pertain to your lifts in grip sports. Rob would go on to compete in several local tournaments before, half a year on, he would find himself competing in Vermont yet again. This time though, things didn't work out quite the same way, as RVJ found himself losing to Eric Roussin across both hands and 2 separate weight classes. Maybe these were some of the pivotal losses that would inspire Rob to do better in the future, as he would never lose to Eric again, and over the next several years, would consistently place high in his weight category in any tournament he entered. During the following years, RVJ would accrue several national titles, and in 2008 would, perhaps more impressively, win his weight class in one of the most prestigious and competitive tournaments of the time in North America. Ruler of the Nation was a tournament that lasted for 3 years and was organized by Gary Roberts, best known today for having filmed and archived a slew of matches from the 90s and 2000s with ARM TV. In the second edition of Ruler of the Nation in 2008, Rob would go on to dominate the middleweight division on the right hand, beating such notables as Chad Silvers and Eric Wolf, amongst others. During the following edition of the Grand Tournament, he would once again go on to do quite well, this time placing third in the heavyweight class with the left hand. He would also feature as part of a best 3 out of 5 challenge match versus Sylvain Perron, a match which Rob lost 1-3, but in which he was then seen to be a giant underdog, making the relatively close result quite impressive. Also in 2008, Rob garnered a significant win in the overalls of the Nevada State Championships versus the GOAT himself, John Brezink. Even though John seems to have given some rope to RVJ at times during the match, it was clear that by then he was able to compete in the upper echelons of the sport, and even do well on a good day. Perhaps in part due to personal issues plaguing him off the table, Rob, now being in his late 20s, early 30s, was experiencing frequent health issues. He sometimes felt sudden onsets of having difficulty breathing, pressure on his chest, and a feeling of the walls closing in on him. Because he figured these symptoms were probably caused by some issue with his heart, as they would often manifest when he was training or producing a significant effort, RVJ decided to take a step back from training and focus more on his health. It wasn't until a significant time later, when these episodes would be characterized as severe panic attacks, that Rob would come to terms with the true nature of them. One such major episode happened as RVJ was traveling to one of the biggest arm wrestling opportunities of his career up until then. Neil Pickup, notorious arm wrestling and strongman commentator and tournament organizer, first took notice of RVJ after his stellar performance at the Ruler of the Nation. They had gone out after the tournament for drinks, something that incidentally had become one of Rob's favorite pastimes, and had hit it off. Rob would later confess to using alcohol as a means of falling asleep, as the young athlete was by now having issues with panic-related attacks more often. Neil thought of Rob as a perfect candidate for his tournament, Arm Wars, and invited him to pull multiple WAF and Brazilian national champion, Marcio Barbosa. On the flight to Las Vegas, where the match was to take place, RVJ experienced a massive onset of panic, much to the surprise and ultimate dismay of the airplane crew and passengers.
So I'm sitting there freaking out. Now I got myself like, you're dead, I can't breathe, something's in my throat, I'm choking. This guy looks at me next to me, he's like, are you okay? I said, no, I'm not, get out of my way. He's like, what? I said, get out of my way. I get up, I go walking down the aisle. The lady's like, sir, you gotta sit down. I'm like, no, I start walking to the cabin. I want to get the water out of the cooler. I'm like, I need water. I'm choking. People are throwing crackers in the air. They think I'm taking over the plane. People are screaming. They thought I was taking over the plane, and I'm walking like a zombie. And the nurse, I'm like, I just need a cup of water. I'm choking. She gave me a couple waters. I drank them. They sent me back to seat. People, if there was an air marshal on, I would have got shot. She's like, you need to go.
After arriving in Vegas and getting in a taxi, he decided to go to the emergency room to get checked out. He subsequently received a clean bill of health and decided to go through with the super match. Despite these events taking place shortly before the match with Marcio, RVJ pulled out an unexpected draw, going 3-3 against a heavyweight champion. The super match started out heavily in Marcio's favor as he quickly surged Rob to the pad. Rob, seemingly still somewhat frazzled, manages to somewhat drain Marcio as he goes on to win 3 drawn-out rounds in a row in the latter half of the match. This despite Marcio being given considerable leeway as far as elbow fouls goes. It was clear that by this time, more than ever, Rob's mental acuity on the day of the match made a huge difference in his performance. After multiple years of semi-inactivity due to nursing a shoulder injury back to health, and perhaps also due to being unable to drive a car thanks to some youthful delinquency, RVJ was made aware of the existence of Wall. If you want to get the full lowdown on the World Arm Wrestling League, I suggest you watch a previous video of mine on the topic. Within the Wall tournament area, Rob decided to try his hand at competing once again. He quickly qualified for the 2015 championship events and seemed to show up in good physical condition. His pulling style, like before, was by now characterized by a relatively slow hit, followed by obtaining hand control and surging through his opponent's arm, often finishing with a top roll. In the finals of the 2015 Wall event, however, Rob would face one of his most formidable opponents, in Toddzilla. In the past, when Todd Hutchings would be active on the circuit, RVJ would often end up on the losing side. Although exceptions to this have certainly taken place, it's safe to say that by this time, a rivalry had been brewing between the two middleweights. During the first round of the championship match, RVJ tries pronating through the hand of Todd, but is quickly stopped in his tracks and driven to the side in true Toddzilla fashion. After this, whatever fire remained in RVJ seems to have been all but extinguished, as Todd holds him comfortably in the center and finishes the round quickly thereafter. In the left-hand division of that same year, Bagent manages to climb to the semi-finals, where he is to face off against veteran puller Storm Chelino. During the match, Rob seems to be visibly frustrated, nervous and somewhat frazzled, accruing several false start fouls. When the athletes get into the straps, Storm all but dominates Rob's hand and pronation completely, eventually winning the match 2-0. In the following year, RVJ managed to qualify for the big championship yet again. This time he made it to the semi-finals and faced as his opponent, yet again, Toddzilla. As is seemingly becoming tradition for Rob by this point, he enters the match somewhat riled up and hungry for a win. But after Todd gets a good quick ready go off on RVJ and pins him comfortably, all the energy and confidence seems to drain from Rob instantaneously. As if mirroring their match the year previous, Todd finishes the match in comfortable fashion once they get to the strap. RVJ would go on to claim the straps were a big factor in his losses during this time, as he could not apply the hand control he is known for. Rob would go on to compete in several Wall Supermatch events during the following years, and even managed to snag the title in 2018, getting a much-needed rematch win in the finals versus Storm Chelino. In this match, Rob's confidence and physicality is on full display, as his mood was seemingly in an upswing during this time. This version of RVJ is clearly dangerous on the table and capable of winning dominantly. With Wall seemingly dissipating out of nowhere and the imminent arrival of a global pandemic, RVJ's presence on the table seemed to waver significantly. Perhaps by being granted more free time because of being homebound by the spread of COVID, RVJ decided to increase his online presence and became involved with several social media. Notorious puller Michael Todd was by this time traveling around the USA, creating content and occasionally arm wrestling real opponents. One of his stops seems to have been RVJ, as they geared up to face each other in a friendly training session. Presumably much to Michael's surprise and dismay, Rob appeared to be inebriated and was all but gracious on the table, deciding to not hold back at all. The friendly sparring quickly turned into a vicious match, perhaps perfectly exemplifying the somewhat fragile egos of both pullers involved. RVJ's YouTube channel quickly gained a significant following, as people were drawn to candid videos about his training, as well as his outspoken opinions on several people and topics in the arm wrestling world. One of these topics was the seemingly rampant use of PEDs within the sport of arm wrestling. Rob claimed the playing field was far from level and that he would dominate even more if everyone was as natural as he claims to be. From this point on, he would be unafraid to use this topic as a reason to validate bad match results, as well as a stipulation or tool to cancel or refuse potential matches. Perhaps partly because of Rob's growing presence and relevance on social media, he got offered to appear again in Neil Pickup's Arm War series. This time the athlete would engage in a super match with the lethally compact Sasho Andreev in the Arm Wars reality check. The match turned out to be quite one-sided, with an efficient and calm Sasho finishing Rob in a dominating fashion. Rob appeared mostly depleted and somewhat submissive during the setup. Once again, RVJ turned to social media to vent about his recent loss and other arm wrestling related philosophies of his. With outspoken opinions on controversial topics, delivered in a typical Rob fashion, comes a lot of critique from other people present in the online space. Rob's seeming inability to ignore comments and video replies from other creators led to somewhat of an online feud between him and Ryan Blue Bowen. This online arguing between the two would eventually lead to a possible super match being discussed. After a lot of back and forth between Bowen and Bagent, a period where the match was cancelled several times over, it seemed the stars would finally align. King of the Table decided to pick the match up and an agreement was reached. The match between the two pullers would take place at King of the Table 3 in August of 2022. Some months before the match was to take place though, the deal seems to have fallen through, with the brunt of the responsibility being on RVJ's shoulders according to the online zeitgeist. Recently, RVJ seems to have started his own pastry business, which appears to be doing really well. Having gained some more financial stability, and perhaps because of performing less physically taxing work, it would seem like the perfect time for Rob to get back into the arm wrestling fold. The way in which he approached this seeming re-entry though involved old habits. Although some YouTube channels already jumped on the opportunity to showcase another drunken, hate-fueled RVJ meltdown, I do think it's worth noting that this is much more a pattern of behavior rather than a standout performance. Even though the end result might be considered entertaining and largely in good fun, the underpinning issues at play might be less funny, if not slightly tragic. In a recent episode of The Fix, RVJ joined the call late into the show. At this point, Devin Leratt and Leonidas Arcona had been on the call too and seemed in good spirits. Rob, almost assuredly spurred on somewhat by alcohol, started calling out Devin and Leonidas. After some back and forth between mainly Devin and RVJ, Devin leaves the call. RVJ, however, continues his tirade, with a somewhat stupefied and incredulous Neil Pickup, Paul Lynn and Doug Ehrlich looking on.
I'll pull him and I'll let him get in a spot and I'll detach his little shitty ass YouTube, Facebook, TikTok bicep right off his body. Watch, fat.
Oh, easy, lad, easy, homie.
After this, Neil finally decides to end the call, and with that, one of the most eventful episodes of The Fix ever. With his appearance came a reinvigorated attention from the community at large towards RVJ. If this will yield an actual match coming to fruition remains to be seen. Despite his public faux pas, occasional outbursts and self-admitted insecurities, I can't help but hope RVJ does not become a poster child for wasted potential in the arm wrestling world, as the talent, strength and even technique to be one of the greats are certainly present. Ultimately, I do truly believe RVJ possesses a great natural affinity for the sport, and given the right circumstances, could be a real contender in the elite arm wrestling scene in his weight class. Whether or not that will ever happen again remains to be seen, and seems to largely depend on Rob not getting in his own way. Showing a good amount of volatility and perhaps even some emotional instability at times is certainly not inhuman, but can ultimately have a real and sometimes negative impact on this athlete's career and performance. My hopes lay mainly with Rob, If and when he decides to take the sport seriously again and pull his act together, I will be the first in line to cheer this entertaining puller on.
Hey, let's not f*** around and let's pull like f***ing men!
Ferocity, strength, and speed are much desired qualities in the arm wrestling world, and few have embodied those qualities like Matt Mask. With his enigmatic personality and intense matches, Mask became one of the most well-liked and feared arm wrestlers in the game, despite never quite reaching the absolute pinnacle of the sport. But in recent years, his fortunes seem to have taken a turn, as he suffered a string of losses that have left many questioning his place among the top elites in the sport. In this video, we'll explore the twists and turns of Matt Mask, examining the highs and lows of his elite career, the challenges he's faced along the way, and what the future might hold for this outspoken and determined athlete. I am the Arm Historian, and I'll be your tour guide as we take a look at the rise and fall of the wild horse Matt Mask. Matt Mask was born on June the 20th, 1981, in or around Timmins, Ontario, Canada. It seems Matt reached his current height and approximate weight at a young age. As a teenager, having always been fit and interested in strength sports, Matt was especially drawn to his grandfather. He describes him as having been a big and strong man, who came across as an intimidating figure and must have left quite an impression on the young boy. At the age of 12, Matt witnessed his grandfather suffer a tragic stroke. Experiencing how such a strong figure in his life could deteriorate so quickly was an event which would inspire him to strive to become and stay strong himself. This focus on strength would continue throughout Matt's school career, as he didn't care much for grades and put a lot of stock in how strong people perceived him to be. During high school, he would often hang out with and wrestle kids who were several years his senior, as he would sometimes end up hurting kids his own age. Throughout his childhood, Matt's favorite movie was Over the Top, which sparked his first interest in arm wrestling. Unsurprisingly, he would often be the first in line to participate in arm wrestling bouts in his local high school. It wasn't until he was 16 years old when he heard about a local arm wrestling tournament being held in a bar during a winter carnival. Upon questioning his dad about joining the tournament, the young Matt Mask was told he should not enter it, as he would probably not stand a chance against the middle-aged miners and loggers that would most likely be participating that day. Determined to prove his strength, Matt ignored his father's advice, snuck out of his home and into the bar through the back door. Perhaps because of Matt's height, or maybe because of a more laissez-faire attitude towards minors in bars at that time, he managed to enter the arm wrestling tournament. The other participants did indeed end up being mostly hardened, middle-aged manual laborers. But despite the seemingly obvious disparity, Matt ended up beating each of his opponents handily and went on to win the tournament, and with that a cash prize of $45, a t-shirt and about 5 free drink coupons, the latter of which he instantly used to consume several beers while he basked in his convincing victory. When looking back on this time, Matt says he especially enjoyed the one-on-one competition aspect of the sport and how it made him feel like he was the stronger man. After getting his feet wet at his first local tournament, it would take Matt another 2 years before being reintroduced to the sport. By this time, he was finishing high school and was known as a big football player who liked drinking, partying, and the occasional brawl. In his own words, he had a lot of pent-up aggression that he wanted to get rid of. By this time, the young Matt was looking for an outlet for this aggression and turned towards sports. With opportunities to practice any kind of competitive sport few and far between locally, Matt transferred to another high school where he could practice football more freely. During this time, he became re-enamored with arm wrestling by regularly challenging and beating the entire football team, as well as renowned locals. Unfortunately, because of low attendance, Matt was unable to graduate from high school and soon returned to his hometown. Following a grudge with a principal of his local high school, Matt soon found himself having to find any form of gainful employment. With opportunities for any kind of worthwhile job unavailable to him in Timmins, he heard about an opportunity to work on oil rigs in Alberta. During this time, Matt had entered a few arm wrestling tournaments, including the provincials. He managed to win second place, only losing out to Devon Lorette. The two had crossed paths once before, but it wasn't until this tournament where the two got to know each other better. Devon took an interest in Matt as an arm wrestler, and the two ended up spending 3 hours on the table in the after-pole post-tournament. Until this time, Matt had fostered a ferociously fast and strong hit, but was clearly lacking in technical arm wrestling. Perhaps somewhat spurred on by his placement in the tournament, as well as some guidance from Devon Lorette, Matt soon found himself training for the sport and developing his skills on the table. During the following years, Matt would go on to win regional as well as national championships, propelling him to become a real contender, not only in Canada, but in the entire North American scene. After the new decade had come and gone, Matt found himself competing in the UAL, a league where he would face off in super matches and do quite well for himself against multiple noteworthy opponents, including John Brezink and Chris Chandler. Because of Matt's stellar performance on the UAL circuit, he came under the keen eye of Neil Pickup, who had by then solidified himself as one of the premier supermatch organizers with Arm Wars. Neil thought Matt's character and style of pulling would fit perfectly within the Arm Wars format, and went on to recruit Matt for several matches. One of the big matches he set for Mask was versus Jordan Sill, an accomplished arm wrestler from Utah. In the 6-round super match, Mask drove Jordan to the pad quickly 3 times in a row. In the latter 3 rounds of the match, however, the athletes went to the strap each time, with Jordan Sill controlling and pinning Mask 3 times. Another match that was set in Arm Wars, in which Matt seemed to get more revved up. He faced off against Lars Rohrbacken. Early on in the match, it was clear Matt possessed a superior hand, a quality the athlete would become known for during his arm wrestling career. Despite this, Lars showed his versatility and arm strength by pinning Matt 5 consecutive times. With the advent of the World Arm Wrestling League, it seemed clear that the Wild Horse would be a perfect fit for the tournaments and super matches. His theatrical and often very entertaining performances within Wall propelled the Canadian puller to a new stratosphere of notoriety within the arm wrestling world. He went on to do extremely well for himself within the boundaries of the league, securing 2nd place in the 2016 Wall Championship on the left hand, losing to a trimmed Devon Lorette, as well as making it to the semi-finals on the right, narrowly losing to a primed Ron Bath. In the following and final year of the Wall Tournament Series, Matt would once again get qualified for the final championship. If you want to know more about what happened to Wall during 2017, I recommend watching my video on the league. The dawn of Wall's supermatch era was sure to provide Matt with another opportunity to prove his worth as a true elite puller. Indeed, he would go on to compete against accomplished pullers like Sylvain Perron and Nick Zina, as well as modern household names like Marcio Barboza, Todzilla, and Devon Lorette. Although doing very well for himself with a positive winning record, the absolute pinnacle of the sport seems to have eluded Matt during this time. At Wall 505, Hermes Gasparini was set to make his US debut in the World Arm Wrestling League, and as a first opponent, the physically imposing Matt Mask was chosen. During the first round, Matt was seemingly caught off guard by the Italian, and was driven to the pad quickly. The next 3 rounds, however, had heavy contested setups, and saw Matt pinning Hermes in convincing fashion. Later, Matt would speak on the match and how he heavily underestimated Gasparini when they first gripped up. After the match, the two pullers had a friendly sparring session, in which Hermes seems to have had the upper hand on Matt. Hermes would go on to claim he was actually way stronger than Matt, and the main reason for the Canadian's victory was the wonky wall rules and reffing. Matt would go on to call Hermes a coward for using that practice session to discredit him, and said that the European champion should have been better prepared for the wall rules. The two would face off again multiple years later in 2021, this time however under a different rule set. In Engin Terzi's East vs West, the two athletes had a hard-fought match, which saw Matt accruing several fouls and the Wild Horse coming out in full display. As if a mirror to their previous showing, Hermes snagged the victory 4-1. At the end, Matt said to Hermes they will pull a deciding 3rd time in the future, a prospect that by now seems unlikely to say the least. Around March of that same year, Matt decided to increase his presence on social media, and in particular on YouTube. In a relatively short time, he gained a very respectable number of followers, probably due to his charismatic and open appearance in front of the camera. He mainly uploaded snippets of his life, behind-the-scenes footage of his training, and his afterthoughts on his matches. Nearly a year later, Matt would go on to feature in the 3rd edition of East vs. West, wanting to prove himself still capable. This time he accepted 2 matches, left and right, taking on some of the strongest prospects in the sport at this time. However, he seems to have injured his foot and showed up to the event with crutches. Ever the fighter, he decided to plow through the pain and compete anyway. His first opponent was the young but supremely impressive Kazakhstani, Morozov on the left hand. Matt and the arm wrestling world quickly realized Morozov's left was world class, and that there was, in effect, nothing he could do. Morozov went on to win the bout 3-0 in convincing fashion. For his second opponent that day, this time on the right hand, Matt had a fiery battle with the Ukrainian Evgeny Prudnik. Matt seemed mentally primed and fought for every inch during the setup, and in typical Matt Mask fashion, providing us with some of the best sound bites from a modern super match, spurred on by a taunting Evgeny. Yevgeny went on to win the match relatively comfortably, showing that even though Mask seemed ready mentally and verbally, he came up short that day, losing 1-3. Even though Matt convincingly lost twice that day, it seems like his trip to Turkey was not completely in vain, as he decided to get a hair transplant. His new hair has since come in strongly and is looking dashing. When competing closer to home, Matt seems to do better on the table. At a fledgling promotion called We the North, Mask was to face off against another accomplished arm wrestler who was on a bit of a losing streak. Krasimir Kostadinov was looking to score a victory over the giant Canadian, but seems to have chewed off more than he could handle. Matt came in seemingly prepared and strong, and all but dominated the Bulgarian champion, providing a much-needed win for the Canadian. By November of 2022, Matt seemed eager to prove he belonged amongst the elite at East vs. West, despite a slew of losses during the past years. In East vs. West 5, he faced off against WAF champion and rising star, the young Latvian Sandris Šedis. Mask, in his usual wild horse fashion, starts off revved up, wanting to finish with his signature explosive hit. However, Sandris would show world-class composure and strength. Once again, it seemed the wild horse was wildly outclassed and competing on a grand international stage, taking not a single round of the Latvian Šedis. Most recently, Matt Mask faced as his opponent the strong Bulgarian hooker, Jordan Tsonev, at B-Strong Arm Wrestling. Jordan took the match 4-0, seemingly able to turn Mask in every round with relative ease. With the East vs. West qualifiers looming, it seems Matt Mask is primed to at least do well in the Canadian edition. One can only hope he will make his way to the finals, and perhaps even entertain us again in another edition of East vs. West. One seemingly major issue that served as a hurdle in Mask's arm wrestling career is the amount and frequency of injuries he has accrued. The amount of table slaps and the fact that he self-admittedly often exerted himself up to and over the limit of his body could not have helped the situation. The body parts that seem to have received the brunt of the abuse are definitely his huge hands. At one point, Matt got so used to his fingers popping out of sockets, he would reset them mid-match, a feat which speaks volumes about his tenacity and no-holds-barred attitude on the table. Despite setbacks in his career and a recent streak of losses against top-level opponents, Matt seems to remain mostly pragmatically positive, taking his defeats in stride. He speaks on his latest performances, and how he is not discouraged and will keep arm wrestling and competing at a high level for as long as he is able to. Ultimately, Matt Mask will continue to hold a special place amongst some of my favorite arm wrestlers. His quick and explosive mentality on the table has served him well during his career so far, even though he has yet to reach the absolute top of the sport. With an ever-positive attitude, mental fortitude, and seeming ability to assess losses, this giant Canadian seems poised to do well for himself in the sport yet again, if he so chooses. Without any distractions, no injuries, and a luscious full set of hair, one can only hope Matt focuses his unfiltered and seemingly unending pool of energy into improving himself on the table and rise yet again.
I like to win fair. Most of the guys don't care how they win, fair or not, they just want to get the win.
One of the most accomplished and globally active arm wrestlers of the past decades, Krasimir Kostadinov is perhaps the very embodiment of a naturally strong and incredibly driven, ubiquitous athlete. Coming from a culture that values strength and arm wrestling, this puller had high aspirations and lofty goals. Although he was well on the way to conquer the highest summits in arm wrestling, as of late, he seems to have had several precarious stumbles in his career. I am the Arm Historian, and today I'll be your tour guide as we take a look at the rise and fall of Krasimir Kostadinov. Krasimir Kostadinov was born on the 4th of April 1988 and hails from the small town of Tutrakan in northeast Bulgaria, right at the banks of the Danube River, which separates it from Romania. As a child, Krasimir describes himself as having been active and mainly interested in football as far as sports go. At 7 years old, he would receive a present from his cousin, a present that would have large ramifications for the young Krasimir's future. On that day, he received a pair of dumbbells and found himself immediately drawn to them. From then on, he trained weightlifting nearly every day as a youngster, something that he quickly realized made him significantly stronger than his peers at the time. At 12 years old, Krasimir found another sport where he excelled in. Handball was relatively popular throughout Europe and beyond, and was recognized as an Olympic sport. It seemed the young Krasimir had a lot of potential in the sport, as he played it on a national level and was approached to be recruited into the national training program. These plans were quickly thwarted by his father though, as he understandably didn't want his, by then 15-year-old son, to travel to and stay at the nation's capital, Sofia, stating he was far too young for such an endeavor. Throughout these years, Krasimir's love for weightlifting and general fitness remained, and he developed a formidable bench press for someone of such a young age. In school though, the usual pastime was usually spent in another form, that of lunchtime battles of arm wrestling. Krasimir found himself to have a real knack for the sport and knew that arm wrestling was highly regarded in Bulgaria. He remembers watching the yearly Bulgarian champion event, which was nationally televised, an event where the 8 best arm wrestlers in the country would face off against each other in one big tournament. Krasimir decided to try his luck at the Bulgarian Nationals and competed in the junior division with little to no preparation. In this, his first tournament, he ended up getting 4th place on the left and 3rd place on the right hand. Only improving from there, it took Krasimir a mere 2 years of competitive arm wrestling to become the overall national champion of Bulgaria before the age of even 20. By this time, it was clear Krasimir was not only a natural contender in his own nation, but also on the international scene, competing and doing well in the European Championships. About his arm wrestling skills at that time, Krasi later would say that he understood what to do on the table immediately and found he just had to increase the strength in his fingers and wrist. He focused solely on arm wrestling strength training, specifically side pressure, back pressure, and wrist strength, which propelled him to be a formidable hook puller and presser. The other countless aspects of arm wrestling were secondary to Krasimir. After doing well on the European tournament scene, he got an invite to the National Pro League, the very league that had inspired him as a youth to try arm wrestling. He proceeded to do well in his first outing and ended up coming in 4th in the prestigious tournament. In 2007, Krasimir competed in the World Championships, which were coincidentally also held at Bulgaria that year. He got a victory in his very first match against the strong Ruslan Babayev, brother of the perhaps better known Rustam Babayev. At the end of the day, Krasimir made it all the way to the semi-finals, getting 3rd place in the 85 kg division on the right hand. Krasimir would continue to do well in several leagues and tournaments throughout the next years, accruing several national titles, as well as the crowning achievement of winning the 2009 European Championships 90 kg right-hand division. The tournament that year was held on Bulgarian ground, which must have made the victory taste that much sweeter to Krasimir. After the turn of the decade in 2011, Kostadinov competed in the WAF Worlds, that was that year held in Kazakhstan. He would end up coming in 1st place in the 100 kg category on the right, beating a lethal Dmitry Trubin along the way, amongst other high-tier pullers. In 2012, Krasimir found himself competing in the Nemirov World Cup. In this prestigious tournament, he managed to make it all the way to the finals in the open weight category, only losing narrowly to a primed Andrei Pushkar, and eventually coming in second, a huge accomplishment in its own right. In that same year, he also had a super match against one of the top pullers of that era, Arsen Liliev. Krasimir came in as a huge underdog that day, but managed to surprise many spectators and fellow pullers. He defeated the Russian athlete in a very contested match, pulling out a narrow victory on fouls. Looking back, Krasi credits this match to be one of his biggest and most influential wins yet. He went on to compete in several editions of the Zloty Tour, NWAF European and World Championships, while relatively consistently doing well for himself in those tournaments. In 2015, during the WAF World Championships held that year in Kuala Lumpur, he managed to win the 90 kg right-hand division. The year after that, he placed number 1 on the left 100 kg division in the WAF Worlds. Throughout the past decade, Krasimir has also not shied away from super match opportunities, locally and abroad, accruing many notable wins over top pullers. Among several of them, even the legendary John Brezink. By 2016, Krasimir would face one of his most formidable opponents yet, in the now undisputed number 1 of the world, Levon Saginashvili. The two met during a match in the European Championships, and it was clear the Georgian Holok was, even then, already much larger than Krasimir. Nevertheless, the athlete slipped, and Krasi stopped Levon in the straps on the inside. From there, he worked on Levon in typical Kostadinov fashion, and fouled him out twice for the win. A year later, the two pullers would meet again, this time on the Zloty Tour. By this time, however, Saginashvili had filled out his frame even more and quickly got the better of the Bulgarian puller with an earth-shattering hit. Several years thereafter, Krasimir still maintained he could potentially beat the Georgian Hulk, an opinion he has perhaps changed by now. By the time 2018 rolls around, Krasimir got invited to appear on the international scene yet again. This time he got approached by the World Armwrestling League to participate in the Wall Supermatch series. At Wall 406, he faced the formidable North American powerhouse, Dave Chaffee. Krasimir managed to make Dave work for it a little in one round, but ultimately succumbed to the Wall veteran, 0-3. Even though the match turned out to be somewhat of a mismatch, Krasimir later went on to say he was the one fighting to get a match against Dave. This is just one example of his unrelenting drive to be the undisputed number 1, leading him to seek out some questionable matchups. Seemingly not dissuaded by his first loss in the Wall Supermatch series, Krasimir would go on to face another fearsome opponent at Wall 506 in the accomplished Brazilian-American Marcio Barbosa. This time, Krasimir's outing proved to be a little less one-sided, as the two had a true nail-biter of a match, with Marcio eking out the victory after a few contested ref calls and hard-fought battles. By the end of the decade, Krasimir had found a new training partner in the rising Bulgarian star Yordan Sonev. The two athletes decided to room together and focus solely on training. For an entire year, Krasi later recalled they did nothing else than sleep, eat and train. However, he would go on to explain that the training ended up being much more beneficial for Jordan than for him. Because of an age disparity, Krasimir felt his recovery time was too long compared to his younger countrymate, and as such he could not keep up without damaging his body in the process. The training must have had some effect though, seeing as in early 2020, Krasimir Kostadinov faced off against a much bigger Polish giant, Alex Kurdecha. In this grueling vendetta match, Krasimir showed real hardened elbow integrity and phenomenal side pressure, coming back from some incredibly compromised positions. And although some would go on to claim the victory was not fully earned, he won that day with a record of 3-4. After a period of relative inactivity, the bars of COVID were lifted and the world was greeted by another premier arm wrestling league. Engin Terzi's East vs West offered a battleground where all the best and upcoming talent from the arm wrestling world could spotlight their prowess. This of course meant that Krasimir Kostadinov couldn't refuse the opportunity to pull in its 3rd edition. As his opponent, Engin had chosen the super heavyweight Turkish puller Arif Ertem. Ardesh's blisteringly fast and ferocious top roll turned out to be too much for Krasimir to handle, leading to a visibly deflating 0-3 loss for the Bulgarian. Not one to be dissuaded easily, Krasimir subsequently accepted yet another invitation to the now premier event. This time he would have as an opponent Levant's training partner and all-around Georgian top roll star, Irakli Zirakashvili. Irakli confidently took the victory that day, pinning Krasimir 3 times with an explosive top roll. In the summer of 2021, Krasimir also faced the Russian giant ice road trucker Vitaly Laletin in Igor Mazurenko's top 8 tournament. Even though he was confident to at least have a fighting chance, he quickly found out Laletin's frame and power was too much for him and lost the match convincingly. In the past, when the two had met on the table, Krasimir confidently beat Vitaly each time. Now, however, the roles were clearly reversed. Until this day though, Krasimir maintains that questionable ref calls occurred during the match, and the two would still be competitive if they were to face each other again. At the start of 2022, Krasimir had an opportunity to pull the North American prospect Corey West in a super match. While facing yet another super heavy opponent of a certain pedigree, it turned out Krasimir was outgunned yet again and lost the match handily. In September of that same year, Krasimir faced off against the Canadian wild horse Matt Mask in the fledgling tournament We the North. Both athletes had been on a bit of a losing streak, which must have ramped up the pressure significantly. Matt Mask managed to break through Krasimir's stellar defense relatively easily and defeated our titular Bulgarian 3-0. More recently, as nearly every year before, Krasimir entered in the World Armwrestling Federation Championships. He ended up placing 5th on the left hand in the 100kg division and 1st on the right hand in the 100kg division. Although admittedly the competition in WAF of that year was relatively soft, Krasi's stellar performance proved he could still hang with the elite within his weight class. His recent entrance in the Russian AMC tournament arguably showed a similar fact, as he ended up with 1 win and 2 losses against some of the top 95kg pullers of the region. In recent years, Krasimir admits to losing a large portion of the drive he once had. A major influence to this supposed lack of drive is the lack of doping tests in large competitions, specifically the Nemerov Cup, which Krasimir always viewed as the ultimate decider for the crowning of the world's best arm wrestler in the past. Igor Mazurenko, the organizer of the prestigious tournament, was unwilling to institute stringent drug testing for his events. A fact that, according to Krasimir, made the playing field woefully uneven and stood directly in the way of him reaching his ultimate goals in the sport. It's safe to assume he holds similar views on many of the modern arm wrestling leagues. Krasimir's refreshing openness about his stance on the rampant use of PEDs in arm wrestling served as a guiding principle throughout the puller's career. Krasimir also has strong views on the King's Move, exclaiming that every time you hold an opponent solely on a bone lock, it should be an automatic foul. A view he shares with and was perhaps partially inspired by his good and longtime friend Engin Terzi.
I think that this thing should be not a joke, because I don't like this movement. And I think that every time you open your opponent's arm until the bone limit, it should be a win for you.
Yeah.
This is what I believe.
Kostadinov discounts any win gained by the King's Move as not a true match win. He goes on to explain that he likes to only win fair, a quality he holds in the highest regard during an arm wrestling match. This mindset probably also plays into Krasimir's aforementioned stance on performance-enhancing drugs. In the end, it can't be denied that Krasimir Kostadinov is not afraid to put himself out there and face any opponent that is thrown his way. One can't help but applaud his sheer determination and unflappable drive to become the undisputed #1 in the world. Although he has risen to the highest echelons in the sport throughout his career, recently he seems to be falling just short of that ultimate goal. If this tenacious Bulgarian veteran of the sport decides to buckle down and focus on his own weight class, I'm sure we will see great things from him in the future.
Guys, the only thing you can do to me is kill me. But what I've done and what I will do, you will never kill it.
Igor Mazurenko has been a mainstay figure in the sport of arm wrestling for quite some time now. Someone who seemingly devoted a large part of his adult life to the study and progress of arm wrestling as a competitive sport. But in reality, who is this industrious and sometimes controversial man really, and how does he fit into the bigger picture of the arm wrestling culture? I am the Arm Historian, and today I'll be your tour guide as we delve into the rise and fall of Igor Mazurenko. As always, if you enjoy my content, it would help me out if you could drag the like button gently into a loving hook and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on all my arm wrestling related content. Igor Mazurenko was born in December of 1968 in Balakleya, a small town in central Ukraine. Although very little is known about Igor during the early years of his life, it's safe to say he developed a fascination with strength and weightlifting at a relatively young age. By 1980, as a young teen, he found himself especially drawn to bodybuilding. From this moment on, he trained often with his friends, mainly lifting weights. By the time Igor graduated high school, he found himself at first trying his hand at medical school. After a short stint there, however, it became clear that this was not something he wanted to pursue further. 2 years later, he moved out to Moscow, where educational opportunities were perhaps more plentiful, and looked into the possibility of enrolling in the Moscow Institute of Sports. In 1987, he became the first student without significant accomplishments within the discipline to be allowed into the school's weightlifting department. Subsequently, he began training in and researching bodybuilding extensively and directed his studies at the institute towards the methodology of bodybuilding and powerlifting. The young Mazurenko appears to have taken a substantial break from his academic pursuits, as during most of the 1990s, Igor has mentioned later to have led a simple life, studying, training, and occasionally trading some goods in markets. Near the start of the new millennium, Igor moved to the neighboring country of Poland, settling down in and around Gdansk. It is here, while running a bar serving Ukrainian cuisine, that he first heard of competitive arm wrestling. While already quite a formidable and accomplished bench presser, he heard of a local arm wrestling event that was being organized close to Gdansk at the Sopot Pier. Considering his bodybuilding and weightlifting background, Igor saw this as a good opportunity to test his strength. He handily acquired first place at the arm wrestling event, but perhaps more importantly for this story, he fell in love with the sport of competitive arm wrestling and saw huge potential in its growing status within the Eastern world. While touring different arm wrestling events, Igor met Neil Pickup. The two had supposedly discussed various ways how best to promote arm wrestling matches and tournaments, with Neil being convinced super matches were the way to go as far as viewability for the sport goes. By the late 1990s, Igor also had contacts with local arm wrestlers and event organizers in his native country of Ukraine, which eventually led him to get in touch with the Ukrainian Arm Wrestling Federation. This organization wanted to introduce arm wrestling as a competitive sport to Poland and found in Igor the perfect middleman to do this. With the backing of the Ukrainian Federation, Igor organized Poland's very first professionally sanctioned and recognized arm wrestling event. Duel of the Giants took place during a bodybuilding competition and was the first in a long line of arm wrestling events put on by Igor in Poland. To further grow the sport, the first arm wrestling club was officially established and registered in Poland and was named Golden Tour. It appears Igor committed fully to his endeavors during the following years, not only by organizing more events, but also, perhaps more importantly, by forging strong connections with the established powers that be within the arm wrestling world in the East. After a visit to the European Arm Wrestling Federation, Mazurenko's fledgling organization seems to have left quite an impression, as the federation agreed to host the 10th edition of the European Championships in Poland. Maybe even more significantly, during the 2000 World Championships, it was decided that the next edition of this grand event would also be hosted in Poland. By doing this, the World Arm Wrestling Federation officially welcomed Poland, and by extension Igor Mazurenko, into the fold. Later on, Igor would go on to found and sit as the president of the Polish Arm Wrestling Federation. Since the dawn of arm wrestling in Poland, something that is at least in large part thanks to Igor Mazurenko, swaths of Polish clubs have been established and the country has started to produce fierce and motivated local athletes, gradually making Poland a real force to be reckoned with on the international arm wrestling scene. After it was decided Poland would host the 2001 World Arm Wrestling Championships, Igor saw a golden opportunity to start his own arm wrestling federation. The Professional Arm Wrestling League, or PAL for short, was born. Under the umbrella of the PAL, Igor would go on to create multiple leagues and tournaments throughout the next decades. One of his more successful attempts at organizing a world-class arm wrestling event was undoubtedly the Zloty Tour, of which the first edition took place in 2000. It was clear that Igor had thrown himself completely and without hesitation at becoming a major figure in the competitive arm wrestling scene. From 2000 to 2003, Mazurenko would go on to organize several Zloty Tour Cups, and the tournament quickly grew to one of the most prestigious tournaments of the area. Many international athletes started to take note, and the top talent in the arm wrestling world at this time flocked en masse to the fledgling tournament. From 2004 onwards, the by this time legendary tournament would be renamed to the Nemerov Cup. Igor had acquired a substantial yet somewhat unlikely sponsor for the tournament in the Ukrainian vodka brand, Nemerov. During these same years, from 2003 to 2008, Igor's figure for promoting arm wrestling did not go unnoticed, as he first obtained a seat as Chief Secretary of the European Arm Wrestling Federation, and later started serving as the Vice President of that same federation. In 2004, Igor also launched one of the first websites completely dedicated to arm wrestling. Armpower.net started out as a small Polish website, but would quickly grow to cover all kinds of arm wrestling related topics. The website still exists until this day and has for a brief period even published an actual paper magazine. Sometime in the latter part of the 2000s, Igor appears to have picked up his further education again, stating he had to study remotely, sometimes traveling back and forward between Poland and a university in Moscow. He went on to write and defend his master's thesis on the training methods of two of his league's star athletes, in Denis Iplenkov and Andrei Pushkar. After obtaining his master's degree in arm wrestling, I know it sounds weird, and I wrote it, he would go on to try and become a doctoral student in the field. Whether this ever amounted to him actually obtaining his PhD is unclear. By 2010, Igor seemed keen to dip his toe into the world of televised arm wrestling super matches. By this time, Arm Wars had been having success with that very same thing, and Igor seems to have even approached Neil Pickup, the creator of Arm Wars, for a possible partnership in getting to air PAL matches on European networks and vice versa. Still wanting to leave his own mark on the scene, Mazurenko would go on to organize numerous vendetta and arm fight events throughout the following decade, all of them consisting of seeded super matches. To better accommodate his lofty goals, and perhaps because his relationship with the WAF had begun to strain, he decided to get a home in the USA and founded another branch of his league, aptly called PAL USA. A league that would organize international super matches and would go on to put on long-anticipated events between internationally renowned pullers. Igor did find himself competing at the World Championships in 2011, something he would do rather rarely throughout his career. He took first place that day in the Open Masters division, making it his biggest accolade as an arm wrestler. The year after that, in 2012, Igor found himself to be involved in quite a potential scandal. News reports appeared stating the arm wrestling organizer was being prosecuted for several violent crimes committed in the latter half of the 1990s in Ukraine. A violent criminal turned police informant had identified Igor as one of two of his accomplices in a string of extremely violent and disturbing robberies. After spending a few months incarcerated and a year passing, while vehemently denying any and all involvement, Igor defended himself in court and was eventually completely acquitted. I believe it's very important to point out that no concrete evidence was ever found of any wrongdoing on the part of Igor, and the fact nothing further ever came of this, and the supposed witness is very unreliable, should be very telling. On the matter of his incarceration and eventual acquittal, Igor would go on to say the following, quote, "I was acquitted, and I'm happy for it, but my family has suffered greatly. 15 years of career as a sportsman and activist has been endangered by slander. It's hard for me to even speak of it. Now I have to start rebuilding my reputation." Unquote. With his name cleared, he returned to what he was doing and went on to be a major arm wrestling tournament and supermatch organizer. While Igor at first had a very mutually beneficial relationship with the WAF, at sometimes even being employed by the organization, by this time and throughout the following years, it became apparent that his feelings on the current and future state of arm wrestling had shifted away from those held by the World Arm Wrestling Federation. Igor had tried to form his own ranking system, to better unify the rankings globally, as they were, and still are, all over the place. An attempt that was quickly boycotted by the WAF. He also had qualms about how the WAF controlled which referees he could use for his events, as well as found them to be woefully underpaid by the Federation. Finally, he found their efforts to institute any form of doping control to be severely lacking and stated that testing athletes for performance-enhancing drugs was the only way arm wrestling could be taken more seriously as a sport. By now, during the latter part of the 2010s, Igor had built a veritable arm wrestling empire in the Eastern Half Front. He was running an arm wrestling streaming service called Armbets.tv and had several of the top pullers from the region under contract with the PAL. One major super match of that era was the left-handed match between Denis Seplenkov and Devin Lerat. The match drew a lot of viewers and went on in arm wrestling history as a clash between two top pullers from the Eastern and Western world. Much like that match, several years later during the reign of Levon in the East and Michael Todd arguably in the West, another showdown was to take place. However, with Levon Saganashvili being under contract with Igor Mazurenko's PAL, terms for the match were found to be too restrictive, and eventually it fell through. As a consequence, the PAL and by extension Igor Mazurenko received a lot of negative attention, with more claims of unfair contracts surfacing and the controlling nature of Igor over his signed athletes. It seemed, for the time being at least, Igor refused to pivot to a more modern approach of single-match contracts. Since then, single-match contracts have become the new industry standard in the arm wrestling tournament scene, leaving athletes with more freedom to choose where to compete and in general leading to more matches. This unwillingness to change was perhaps one of the reasons the PAL would eventually all but fizzle out. Despite one of Igor's biggest events yet being planned, the top 8, much like a lot of other leagues at the time, saw the undeniable impact of the COVID pandemic. With only a few of the planned matches having happened, Igor was forced to postpone the rest of the matches and eventually, quietly let the event die. While Igor is maintaining the assurance that future big events under the PAL will take place, for now we are left to wait and see if such a thing will actually happen. Recently, it has been reported that Igor is back in Ukraine, specifically in his hometown, to help with the war effort. He is said to be working in the field of assistance, mainly in logistics, providing space for incoming people and organizing their stay or onward journey to safer places. One important contribution by Igor Mazurenko to arm wrestling that is often overlooked is his impact on the current widespread arm wrestling tables used competitively. In 2002, the WAF decided to accept proposals for a new unified standard of arm wrestling table. Igor spent more than a year together with a Polish metal crafting company, designing, testing and improving the ultimate arm wrestling table, according to his specifications. At the 2002 World Championships, the WAF almost unanimously agreed that Igor's table was the best out of all taken into consideration. From that day on, Mazurenko tables formed the new golden standard for professional arm wrestling tables all over the world. The tables themselves, or tables based directly on them, are still in use in almost every major tournament to this day. Igor also spent a substantial amount of time and resources into developing his own line of arm wrestling training implements. By now, it should be clear that Igor Mazurenko is a man with a clear vision for arm wrestling that seems to be set in stone, rather than subject to change, a quality that seems directly opposed to his academic and scientific inclinations. In science, one welcomes new evidence and theories and adapts their way of thinking to that, a mindset that appears to sometimes be somewhat lacking in Igor's approach to competitive arm wrestling. Despite a sometimes rather controlling and worrying mindset towards his own leagues and the athletes who participate in them, I believe Igor's motives as a force in arm wrestling are mostly good, albeit somewhat archaic in nature. Whatever your opinion of Igor Mazurenko in any of the many roles he tries to fulfill, it cannot be denied that he has had a massive influence on the competitive arm wrestling scene, as well as arm wrestling culture as a whole, during the last 2 decades, and helped in putting Eastern arm wrestling on the map. Whether we'll see another arm wrestling venture from Igor in the future remains to be seen, but would be, in this anthropomorphic arm's opinion, a good thing. Wow, that sure was a story. They don't make him like Igor anymore. Who would you like to see in one of these next videos? Leave it in the comments. Now here's Dave Chaffee.
Dave's trying to come up and engage a press. He's going for it like never before.
Notorious in the arm wrestling world for his raw power and stoic demeanor, despite suffering from several serious injuries, Dave Chaffee has been at the top of the elites in the sport for almost as long as he has been arm wrestling. Lately though, it's safe to say this super heavyweight contender has been going through a rough patch and has accrued a number of unfortunate losses. Therefore, it seems like the perfect time to illuminate Dave Chaffee's career and life in arm wrestling. I am the Arm Historian, and today I'll be your tour guide as we look at the rise and fall of Dave Chaffee. David Chaffee was welcomed into the world on the 20th of January 1977 and found himself at a young age to be living in Erie, Pennsylvania, a place he would end up calling home until this day. Although little is publicly known about Dave's childhood and life as a young adult, he has mentioned having arm wrestled with friends from a young age and doing well at it. His father was also clearly instrumental to Dave's development as an athlete, supporting his son throughout his career, being present at a lot of Dave's sporting endeavors. Among these were basketball, baseball, and football, sports he played throughout high school. It's clear that Chaffee also had a lot of potential for strength sports, which led him to develop his power throughout early adulthood. By the time 2006 came around, at the age of 29, Chaffee was working at a local gym and couldn't help but notice a flyer on the wall. The poster was advertising an upcoming arm wrestling tournament, set to take place in November of that same year. Dave remembered that he knew of someone who had told him earlier he was an arm wrestler. Intrigued by the prospect of competitive arm wrestling, he decided to reach out to the man and ended up meeting at his house to learn about the sport. James Wagner was an already accomplished arm wrestler and was more than happy to welcome the strong and physically imposing Dave Chaffee into the sport. Dave would go on to participate in the aforementioned tournament and ended up coming in first place, a true testament to the raw power he already possessed. In Dave's second tournament, however, in the Ohio State's amateur division of 2007, disaster struck, as the fledgling arm wrestler broke his right arm during a match with Doug Allen. With the unending support and encouragement from his training partners, which now also included the notorious future WAL ref Bart Wood, this unfortunate incident didn't dissuade Dave from continuing his journey within the arm wrestling world. He let his right arm heal for about a year, but continued general training. Despite his motivation for the sport, this injury would prove later to be the first in a rather long string of trauma to his body that would eventually catch up with the athlete. Throughout the following years though, Chaffee would start dedicating more time to training on the table, as well as ramping up his gym time. He would later stay to have table time once every week, and trained at the gym or at home every remaining day of the week, sometimes making time for 2 to 3 training sessions every day. In 2009, Dave had set his sights on the US Nationals, but decided this time he would try to cut weight to enter into a lower weight category. He ended up weighing in at under 220 pounds, a weight far below his usual. In his own words, this led to a significant loss in power, and in hindsight was deemed a bad idea. From this time on, Dave would start his undeniable ascent and cemented himself as a mainstay among the super heavyweight elite within the sport of competitive arm wrestling. As a first major accomplishment, he ended up participating in the 2010 WAF World Championships and securing gold in the 110 kg right-hand class. Throughout the next couple of years, Dave showed his unrelenting training was starting to pay off in a major way, doing very well at several high-stakes tournaments. One such event was the 2011 Arnold Classic, where he would make it all the way to the semi-finals, losing out against another powerhouse in arm wrestling, but from the East. Denis Saplenkov and Dave Chaffee were often compared within arm wrestling circles, and the two would eventually form a long-lasting, friendly rivalry. Another example where the two juggernauts showcased their awesome power was at the 2013 edition of the Nemiroff Cup, also known as the Zloty Tour. During the tournament, Dave surprised everyone by beating Dennis, who was on quite a lengthy winning streak. This feat helped propel Dave to be in the conversation for truly being amongst a world-class openweight elite. Fresh off the airplane, returning from the Nemiroff Cup, Dave joined as a prominent cast member of the newly conceived arm wrestling reality TV show, Game of Arms. When talking about Game of Arms in retrospect, Dave denotes traveling and socializing to be his favorite aspects of the show. He didn't care much for the cameras and more dramatic twists, as he describes himself as a quiet guy and being quite camera shy. If you want to learn more about Dave's role in Game of Arms or about the reality show in general, be sure to watch my video on the subject after you finish this video. After his noteworthy appearance on Game of Arms, Dave was made aware of a new arm wrestling league being started in North America. The WAL, or the World Arm Wrestling League, had close ties to the Game of Arms, and Dave's longtime friend and training partner, Bart Wood, ended up becoming a head referee in the league. Chaffee would go on to compete in every year the WAL was organized and would turn out to be a top contender for first place in the Openweight Championships every time. He won the Super Heavyweight Championships on the right in 2014 and 2015, and narrowly came in second in 2016 and 2017, losing out to Travis Bagent and Michael Todd respectively. During the Supermatch era of Wall, in the subsequent years, Dave also did really well on a consistent level, having wins over some of the most impressive names in arm wrestling. If you want to learn more about the World Arm Wrestling League, including but not limited to Dave Chaffee, be sure to check out my video on the topic after watching this video. During and after the conception of the WAL, Dave would never shy away from entering local as well as international tournaments and vendetta or super matches. It seems that by way of more exposure within the arm wrestling scene and beyond, he gets categorized as an extremely powerful puller, but someone lacking in the more technical aspects of the sport. The mantra of Dave using almost exclusively side pressure has been repeated ad nauseum by now. This reputation would follow the athlete throughout his career, and a lot of people's views on Dave Chaffee as a professional arm wrestler has only become more nuanced during the last few years. When the COVID pandemic hit, a lot of potential matches and events fell through, and Dave Chaffee was not exempt from this. When a big part of the world opened up again to international travel, Dave jumped at the opportunity to measure himself to the top of the elites within the sport once again. In September of 2021, as part of a top 8 BAL match, Dave was given the opportunity to challenge the undisputed #1 puller in the world, Levan Saganashvili. During the match, it became clear that Levan outpowered Dave rather easily, after which Dave lost 0-6. He would later clarify that he tried slipping from the Georgian giant, but his hand control was too strong. Obviously not deterred by this rather expected loss, Dave would enter one of the most fully booked years in his arm wrestling career, participating multiple times in the two top-tier international leagues, King of the Table and East vs West. One of these matches came in April of 2022 at King of the Table 3. Chaffee was set to face the Polish giant Alex Kurdecha. Kurdecha's stock in the international rankings was at an all-time high around this time, so when Dave defeated him in a rather convincing 5-1, his own status rose significantly once again. Perhaps for that reason he was thrown into the deep end of the super heavyweights at East vs West. With only about 3 months between the matches, he faced veteran Georgian athlete Gennady Krikvinya in May of 2022, and straight after that, Kazakhstani rising superstar Artem Morozov in August. Both matches played out much in the same way, with Dave quickly overpowering his opponents in the first 2 rounds. After this though, he seemingly gassed out and lost the subsequent 3 rounds, and by that the match. A couple of months later, Dave would face another giant in the Russian ice road trucker, Vitaly Laletin. This match, held at King of the Table 5 in October of 2022, turned out to be one of, if not the most entertaining and grueling match of Dave's career. This 7-round death match, which Dave ultimately won, dispelled all doubts about Dave's versatility and endurance on the table, or lack thereof, with the South American often transitioning to a full-on press. Just over a month and a half after this draining super match, Dave would face an even bigger challenge in the then arguably world #2 Italian gladiator Hermes Gasparini. Although both athletes were visibly winded by the end, and Dave managed to give Hermes a true battle, the Italian ended up sweeping the match 3-0. 2 East vs West events later, during May of 2023, Dave faced the veteran Georgian puller Revaz Lutidze. Lutidze was clearly on the way up in the rankings and wanted to make a point in his match against Dave. With Revaz seemingly succeeding in what he set out to do, Chaffee got spanked in blistering fashion 3-0, with the American not even being able to slip out of Revaz's iron grip. Dave's most recent super match was a rematch of sorts, with his longtime frenemy, Devin Lorette. Much like the lead-up to their earlier WAL match, the vitriol and general trash talk was plentiful and at times almost believable. On the 25th of June 2023, at King of the Table 7 in Dubai, the two titans of North American arm wrestling faced each other once again. This time, however, the way the match played out was radically different. From the first round on, it became apparent quickly that Devin was able to take control of the entire affair. Chaffee became aware of this fact early on in their clash and seemed for the most part to accept his fate. Dave lost the match in convincing fashion and shortly after would announce a break in his arm wrestling career after August of the same year, even hinting at a possible retirement. This will come after a match he had scheduled with the young Bulgarian, Jordan Tsonev. Opinions from arm wrestling fans were sloppily lobbed in Dave's direction, sometimes claiming Dave just accepted as many matches as he could for financial gain, even though he knew he couldn't win due to injury. Chaffee's longtime nickname of Easy Money didn't help matters here. The athlete seemed to find a lot of support and refuge with his family though. From social media posts and interviews, it is clear Dave has a lot of love and dedication for his wife and children. Tangentially, he also possesses two rather prominent tattoos on his arms, both related to his favorite video game, Grand Theft Auto. Gaming apparently plays a big role in the life of Dave and his family, with the music at his wedding even coming directly from the video game. Although at times Dave did fairly to very well on the left arm, it's safe to say his right far outweighed the strength and mobility of his left arm and hand. A big part of the reason for this is that throughout his career he has accumulated a number of neck injuries, resulting in part of his left arm to atrophy and even 2 fingers becoming completely numb. These injuries also had a substantial effect on Chaffee's overall health and strength, with the athlete's performance on the table with the right arm often being directly correlated to the current status of his injuries. Dave has always been candid about his neck injury and other qualms that limited his body, but never explicitly offered this as an excuse for poor performance. In this way, it's safe to say that part of Dave's revered status within the sport is not only owed to his tremendous strength, but also his unflappable sense of sportsmanship and pragmatic modesty before, during, and after matches. In post-match interviews, win or lose, I've never observed Dave Chaffee to be anything but generous to his opponents and level-headed towards his own prowess as an arm wrestler. It's clear Dave Chaffee is an avid arm wrestler who possesses, when physically healthy, an extreme potential for explosive strength and fighting spirit on the arm wrestling table. Despite his rather understated demeanor compared to his arm wrestling peers, I believe it is clear from his history within the sport that he cares a great deal about the sport and its development. On a personal note, I hope Dave Chaffee finds his way back to the higher echelons of the tournament scene after a well-deserved break.
You know, I don't think I'm that much different than anybody else, really.
A true behemoth of arm wrestling, both in stature and accomplishments. Richard Lupkes seemingly came into the sport at the highest level decades ago and even managed to dethrone the legendary John Brzenk for a time. Was this famous puller's incredible power his only real weapon on the table, or was there more at work than meets the eye? With some delayed comebacks possibly in the works at a rather advanced age, it seems like the ideal time to respectfully dissect the ups and downs of this legendary arm wrestler's career. I am the Arm Historian, and indeed, this is the rise and fall of the Leviathan, Richard Lupkes. Richard Lupkes was born on October 5th, 1956, and as a child was raised on a farm, where he quickly got used to daily manual labor. All throughout school, he had to help work on the family farm, which prevented him from engaging with organized sports, although he did manage to squeeze in a little softball every now and then. It's also safe to say the heavy-duty manual labor has contributed to developing a large amount of strength at a young age. He entered his first arm wrestling tournament in 1974 at age 18, a small one held in a high school. The young Lupkes had seen a poster advertising it in a local gas station, and looking for a reprieve from his daily farming chores, he managed to actually win his weight class, and by extension a trophy, something he was at the time very proud of. 3 or 4 months after that, he decided to follow up his win with yet another one in the Arizona State Championships. About a year later, he would accrue his first second place at the Iowa States, which was still a strong showing for the inexperienced arm wrestler. Even though by this time the young Lupkes was a married man with many responsibilities, his loss seemed to have fueled his passion for getting stronger. He bought a set of plastic weights and started using them on a daily basis, basically learning as he went. Even though these early tournaments had all been stand-up events, Richard would go on to completely dominate the sit-down scene throughout his career. Sit-down arm wrestling was still popular at the time and was touted as being all about strength and less so about technique. Richard claims to have never lost a sit-down match in his life, winning many world and national titles in this variant of arm wrestling. By the late 70s, Lupke seemed fully hooked by arm wrestling. He participated in the World Championships in Kansas City at the Worlds of Fun, where in the first edition, Lupkes took second place only to Al Turner, former sparring partner of Rocky Marciano. At the next edition of the same tournament, Richard made it to the finals once again, and when the prizes were announced to be a motorcycle for first place and a brand new arm wrestling table for second place, Richard knew he'd rather have the table than the motorcycle and came in second. In 1978, he managed to qualify for the Petaluma Championships. At the time, it was the biggest event around and was even televised. In this single elimination wrist wrestling tournament, Richard lost his second round after a war in the first. He would go on to say this tournament was somewhat of a wake-up call for him. It even resulted in him only joining a select few small tournaments throughout the next years, while bulking up to the super heavyweights and doing a lot of strength training. Elbow issues would also become a mainstay problem for the gentle giant from that time forward. By 1986, a full 8 years later, one day a friend of Richard's was visiting and happened to have with him a Truckers magazine. In it, there was an article promoting the biggest arm wrestling tournament the world had ever seen, Over the Top. Qualifiers were taking place all over the US, and Richard decided to join one that was held in Chicago. The day of the tournament, he easily took first place and found himself qualified for the main event. He ended up participating in the Truckers class of Over the Top, aptly named as the grand prize was a giant truck. Richard ended up losing to John Brezink, the eventual winner of the class, and ended up in third place. Unbeknownst to the two men at the time, this would be the start to a years-long friendly exchange between them. During the late 80s, Lupkes and Brezink would battle for the #1 spot in the sport quite often. They exchanged wins between each other at tournaments like the Sands International event, the World Wrist Wrestling Championship, and even in the Yukon Jack Nationals of 1990, where John reclaimed the throne once again. By the time the start of the 90s had rolled around, Richard Lupkes was offered an opportunity to try his hand at professional wrestling. After moving to Chicago, he decided it wasn't for him and he wanted to be able to spend more time with his family. During this time, he also faced John Brezink once on the arm wrestling table, where Richard unfortunately tore his rotator cuff in the ensuing battle. This seems to have served as some kind of a catalyst for Richard to decide to withdraw from arm wrestling in general. He stopped arm wrestling completely from 1991 to 2006, but did however maintain an active lifestyle and often worked out in the gym. By this time, he had also acquired a job as an operations manager at a local truck stop. Eventually, Richard and family decided to move back to Minnesota, where he decided to start his own trucking company. One day in 2006, Richard was pulled back into the sport in his early 50s when he heard wind of the Ruler of the Nation tournament. Gary Roberts' Ruler of the Nation attracted the top talent of the day in athletes like Travis Bagent, John Brezink, Don Underwood, Michael Todd, Ron Bath, and Ryan Espy. After 15 years of inactivity, Richard managed to fight his way to third place in the super heavyweight class. After proving he still belonged with the absolute top of the arm wrestling world, Richard started competing again on a regular basis, doing well at a national level. His newfound confidence in his arm wrestling culminated in a massive first-place win at the 2008 Arnold Classic, beating out the likes of John Brzenk and Tim Bresnan, and becoming the first man over 50 to win the super heavyweight category in the tournament. Richard himself describes this as the most significant win in his career. To the rest of the arm wrestling community, the message was clear: the Leviathan is back from the deep. 2 years on, in 2010, Richard found himself pulling at the US Nationals in Salt Lake City and was up against Tim Bresnan. Richard decided to try to equal Tim's back pressure without going for the pin and ended up tearing his bicep in two. The doctor treating the injury had never seen a full muscle tear of that nature.
X-ray of it, and he says, I've never seen this before, because he says usually the tendon will tear off either, high or low, and they just repair the tendon. He says, I've never seen the muscle. He said, your bicep looks like the head of a mop. He says, it's just, everything's shredded in there.
By this time, Richard returned to his farming roots and was growing soybeans and corn while performing as a personal trainer during winter. After he somewhat recovered from that unfortunate injury and winning a world title in Mesquite in the process, Richard was recruited to pull in Neil Pickup's Armoire Super Series. He faced off against multiple opponents that winter's day in 2010 at the top of the MGM in Las Vegas, getting a win on both Tim Bresnan and Ryan Espy, but losing out against Devin Lorette. He would ultimately be featured a couple times more in the Armoire Series in the ensuing years. By spring of the following year, now 2011, Richard decided to compete once again at the Arnold's Classic. This time, first place was not in the cards for him though. He did have an incredible battle with Denis Siplenkov, showcasing Richard was actually capable of some really technical arm wrestling when he was forced to. The following years, Lupkes continued to pull in several events, often but not always under the UAL, one of which was the My Gold Classic in 2012, where he ended up taking second place, only losing against Devin Lorette. Although it's clear he was still a formidable arm wrestler amongst the elites, he wasn't at the absolute pinnacle of the sport as he was before. It seems arm wrestling was evolving, and new strength phenoms were popping up all over the world. Throughout his career though, Lupkes never shied away from competing with international athletes, which was further exemplified in his PAL Vendetta match against Andrei Pushkar. Richard was quite impressed with what he experienced that day.
I mean, it was like hooking onto a truck. Incredible.
Later, he would often say Pushkar was the strongest person he had ever felt on the table. In the lead up to the COVID pandemic, Richard was still reasonably active on the arm wrestling scene, even though he had surgery on both wrists for carpal tunnel syndrome. Although never taking an active role on social media himself, he also participated in several interviews during this time and talks candidly and with great knowledge on arm wrestling. However, tournaments and super matches quickly died down during the pandemic, and Richard seems to have caught a bad case of COVID-19. When the wheels on the arm wrestling tournament scene started turning again, whispers emerged about the possible return of Lupkes, but for a while nothing concrete was announced. After a significant time away from the sport, Richard planned yet another comeback. His grand return match was set to take place at the 4th edition of Michael Todd's Monster Factory in the spring of 2023. The by now 66-year-old Richard was set to face the young American up-and-comer Chan Shaw. Unfortunately, not long before the event was to take place, Richard had to pull out due to a back injury. It seems his age and wear and tear on his body are unfortunately starting to catch up with him, which, in my opinion, doesn't mean we should count Lupkes out quite yet. With rumors about his return going around, I would be the first in line to cheer the gentle giant on in his arm wrestling endeavors. Throughout his nearly 50-year career in arm wrestling, Richard Lupkes has always maintained to never have had regular practice on the table, deciding instead to focus more on developing his general strength by weightlifting. While oftentimes physically imposing and fired up on the table, during my research I haven't come across one instance of Richard being anything other than a gentleman, and he always appears humble off the table. After hearing him speak, I can't help but feel like arm wrestling was never really about winning or losing for Richard Lupkes. He enjoyed the process of getting stronger and wanted a tangible way to compare it with others. His style was never the cleanest, nor the most technical, yet watching him arm wrestle instantly reveals an admiration and true passion for strength and the sport of arm wrestling. Let's hope in the future we might be so lucky as to experience it again.
Hey, historian's currently in the process of making a video on me, just a heads up. Oh, thank you very much. That will be an interesting one. I hope it's got a good conclusion. I hope it goes through all the ebbs and flows of the 10 years.
Misunderstood ambassador of arm wrestling or delusional troublemaker, opinions on Ryan Blue Bowen within the arm wrestling world are about as varied and plentiful as Angerbayev's technical arsenal. With undeniably lofty goals and an unwavering penchant to fall out of favor with the powers that be, let's turn our ever-vigilant gaze towards Ryan's career and life in arm wrestling. I am the Arm Historian, and today I'll be your tour guide as we explore the rise and fall of Ryan Blue Bowen. Born in Australia in 1985, Ryan Blue Bowen developed a competitive spirit and a strong sense of Australian pride from an early age. According to his own account, his enthusiasm for sports was already quite present at the tender age of 3 when he expressed a desire to pursue a professional career representing Australia. Casual arm wrestling became a favorite pastime during his school years, and he enjoyed it so much that on his 12th birthday, he made a daring bet with his father. Wagering $50, he confidently claimed that he would defeat his dad in an arm wrestling match by the time he turned 18. He not only held his own, but also excelled against his peers, with his first defeat in arm wrestling occurring at the age of 17. He was always captivated by the exceptional athletes who reigned supreme in their respective fields. At the tender age of 7, he embarked on his journey in the world of tennis, and over the years he honed his skills to reach a relatively high level in the sport. This early experience on the tennis court, in his own words, would later prove instrumental in shaping his arm wrestling prowess, as it contributed to his excellent pronation and the dominance of his right arm. Apparently ranked in the top 10 of youths in Australia at age 17, Ryan found himself having to deal with a large amount of performance anxiety, something that he would seemingly try to deal with by projecting bravado and confidence in his own abilities until this day. As he transitioned into adulthood, Ryan made a significant decision to pursue a career in the Australian Army. It was during his time in the military that the moniker Blue became synonymous with Ryan Blue Bowen. Ironically, this nickname was a deliberate misnomer, a playful nod to his distinctive red hair. He discovered competitive arm wrestling at 27 years of age and quickly fell in love with the sport when a distributor entered Bowen's store and challenged him to an arm wrestling match. It is perhaps in this relatively small and niche sport that he saw the perfect opportunity to rise up the ranks and achieve his lifelong dream of becoming a professional athlete at the top of a sport. At the time, in Australia, arm wrestling opportunities as well as potential training partners were few and far between, something Ryan would strive to change during his career in the sport. He quickly looked for an arm wrestling club and soon would become only the 3rd person to join local arm wrestlers in Queensland. Seems right from the start, Bowen was determined to jump headfirst into arm wrestling, not only reaching for the highest competitive spheres of the sport, but also wanting to cement himself as a main figure in the sport's slowly but surely growing online presence. After all, documenting his journey in arm wrestling might open the door to financial benefits and might even provide an additional avenue to achieve great renown in the sport. In May of 2013, Ryan would jumpstart his online presence on social media with the creation of the Ryan Blue Bowen YouTube channel. A month later, he would start uploading videos, many of which consisted of Ryan having table time while promoting a product line of supplements called Monsta and taking place mostly in the supplement store Ryan was working at. Also present are videos that showcase quite lofty goals that Ryan held for his arm wrestling career.
But my biggest goal for my overall progression in arm wrestling is to reach the #1 rank for the overalls.
These sorts of statements would eventually become a kind of pattern throughout Ryan's career and would go on to lay the groundwork for future detractors as well as supporters. During the following years, Ryan would start making a name for himself in the Australian competitive arm wrestling scene. He would go on to do well at a series of tournaments and even featured, alongside his father, in a brief human interest story on the local news, talking eagerly about pursuing an international career in pro arm wrestling. Fast forward to 2014, Ryan Bowen reached out to Neil Pickup, organizer of the Arm Wars Super Series, to try and secure a super match. Neil Pickup at first liked Ryan's enthusiasm and confidence, and says he has always respected arm wrestlers who try to make their ambitions a reality, something that certainly applies to Ryan. Being only about a year and a half into the sport, Ryan faced his first official international super match opponent in Anil Najran. Although both still visibly inexperienced and somewhat nervous looking, the athletes turned out to be quite even on the table, and Ryan ended up winning the closely contested and frankly entertaining match. This Arm Wars feature set up the stage for Ryan to be looked at as a tenacious puller, willing to put his frame on the line. In October of 2017, Ryan felt ready to face a contender from the US in a super match and decided to fly out the Bama Bull, Justin Bishop, to Ryan's hometown of Brisbane. Justin was amongst the top guys in the US in the middleweight division and considered a true contender for the Wall Hammer. It's clear Ryan wanted either a challenge or was very sure of his own capabilities. The match was pretty handily won by the Bama Bull, with the American seemingly outpowering the Australian Ryan Bowen. It wasn't to be a complete loss though, as judging by Ryan's content around that time, he made good use of Justin Bishop's presence, and collaborations were plentiful. Later that year, Ryan would participate in the Australian Nationals, and managed to make it all the way to the finals after losing a hard-fought strap match against Danny Tesh. Up until this moment, Ryan had been putting a lot of work and time into creating a series of vlog-style videos for his YouTube channel, called The Daily Arm Wrestle. After producing well over 100 of these episodes, it seemed Ryan had uncovered a secret formula that would change his content drastically in early 2018. His daily arm wrestle videos were often getting 100 to a few thousand views at the very most. Then Ryan discovered that he could take arm wrestling matches from several different sources and create a series called The Breakdown, where he would commentate over famous matches from arm wrestling's past. Citing fair use and considering it transformative content, Ryan defended himself against a few people who criticized this move. The subsequent channel growth these videos brought with them must have quickly outgrown the potential copyright headaches and mounting public critiques, as a lot of these videos remain amongst the most viewed on Ryan's channel, with one of them garnering a massive 5.1 million views so far, while another has crossed the 1.6 million mark. It's clear Ryan had struck upon something of a goldmine, and doubled down on creating similar content while holding a, in his eyes, perfectly legal position. This single-minded approach would eventually become a pattern in Ryan's dealings with members of the arm wrestling community. Later in 2018, Ryan Bowen was offered an opportunity, courtesy of one of the biggest names in arm wrestling. Travis Bagent was at the time organizing a tournament and wanted to include Ryan Bowen as a puller and by extension a representation of his brand, pound for pound. Ryan gleefully accepted and thus got his foot in the door with some of the US arm wrestling elite, and while in the States he met the GOAT himself, John Brzenk, and the two quickly built up somewhat of a relationship. They would go on to collaborate on several videos and eventually even decided to produce a relatively short-lived podcast. Ryan appearing alongside the greatest of our sport certainly resulted in his credibility, as well as his notoriety growing amongst the arm wrestling community. Before long, Ryan was also rubbing elbows with other legends of the sport, one of which being Devon Larratt. Larratt and Bowen seemed to have built up somewhat of a friendly working relationship, and Bowen seemed captivated by Devon's approach to training and arm wrestling. Although certainly before this, Ryan was already heavily focusing on his right arm alone, it seems he completely adopted the way of the giant pumpkin from Devon and a heavy propensity for strap pulling. In July of 2019, the World Arm Wrestling League would put on a super match extravaganza with the Wall 504 Super Showdown Series in Los Angeles. Ryan Bowen was offered his WAL debut in one of the matches of the night, facing Alan Guerra, a seasoned puller with an 18-8 record in the league. In the first round of the match, Bowen seemed outclassed, but remained calm and changed strategy in the following rounds. Alan's hand and wrist were visibly outshined by Ryan's, and the Australian would end up winning the entire match, despite his Mexican opponent's clear arm strength. After this result for Ryan, the path forward was crystal clear. He would face more opponents in the WAL until conquering the title in his weight class and reclaiming the hammer from Rob Vigent Jr. for his mentor Todd Hutchings, or at least that's what he hoped. However, things didn't quite work out that way, and WAL soon closed its doors, partially thanks to the COVID pandemic, making any future match prospects for Ryan unlikely. In the latter part of 2019, Ryan decided it was time to participate in one of the most prestigious tournaments at the time, in the PAL Zloty Tour. The Zloty Tour had built a reputation of harboring some of the best and toughest competition in the arm wrestling world, a fact that didn't seem to halt Ryan's confidence in the lead-up to the event. Bowen ended up placing 11th out of 17 on the right hand, and placed 12th out of 14 on the left, both in the 95 kg category. In his review of the event, he quotes Rigid Rule Arm Wrestling several times, alluding to this being one of the reasons he didn't place quite as high as expected. Although continuing the trend of seemingly overestimating his own and his countrymen's ability on the table, I believe he deserves some amount of respect for putting himself out there in this way, and at least trying to compete with the elite of the sport. Soon, Ryan would find himself in the sights of Canadian puller Chris Gobby. Chris was a relatively experienced arm wrestler who had even pulled a Vendetta match and was making quite a name for himself in the lighter classes in North America as someone who didn't shy away from controversial comments. He's also apparently known in the arm wrestling scene for wearing plateau shoes during matches, and is often referred to by followers of the sport as a troll. The two had some back and forth online, with Gobby commentating on Ryan's lack of status and experience within the arm wrestling world. But as fate would have it, coincidence or not, Devon Larratt was looking to put on a tournament in Canada called the Bottom 8 and saw in Ryan and Gobby the perfect candidates to participate in this tournament. Ryan as well as Gobby both seemed eager to accept the invitation and would begin to fan the flames during the lead-up, although having previously faced a healthy amount of criticism from the arm wrestling world. In the Bottom 8 tournament, Ryan first faced and easily beat Chris Gobby, then defeated Evan Burgoyne in a slightly more difficult fashion, and finally took first place when he pulled Artem Taranenko in the finals. This victory was a very public win for Ryan, and certainly helped cement him as at least a legitimate arm wrestler. Another rivalry that cultivated online and involved Ryan was one with the young up-and-coming Floridian Chan Shaw. In early 2020, at the Battle of the Beach tournament, the two decided to put on a super match, with each putting $500 on the line. The young Chance came into the match confidently and, judging by the crowd, clearly had the home base advantage. After a convincing pin from Chance in round 1, Bowen kept his composure and ultimately came out a winner after exchanging blows with Chance in this buckle-dominated match. Yet another notorious arm wrestler who Ryan, over time, developed quite a rivalry with is the American Rob Vigent Jr. RVJ, the Rise and Fall alumni, had become quite a public and outspoken figure in the online arm wrestling scene. Perhaps wanting to capitalize on the notoriety of Ryan as well as RVJ, the two lobbed criticism back and forth, with Ryan maintaining he could beat Rob in a super match, and Rob diminishing Ryan's arm wrestling capabilities. Although a match between the two seemed likely and imminent on multiple occasions, in the end, no such match ever took place and public interest for it waned. In 2021, Ryan Bowen announced he would be pulling longtime friend and training partner Lachlan Adair in a super match at the Australian Gold Coast Powerhouse Super Series. As the match approached, trash talk ramped up between the apparent friends, and Ryan made it clear he estimated his chances as really high and that a potential victory was realistic. During the actual match in October of that year, Lachlan easily outpowers Ryan though and wins every round in convincing fashion. Afterwards, criticism once again reached Ryan, as the public felt deceived during the lead-up to the match, with Ryan allegedly using his platform as a way to mislead potential bettors about his chances in the match. In August of 2022, Ryan had found his way into East vs West 4 and was to pull in a super match against longtime co-podcast host and friend, Coach Ray, for which Ryan was to drop in weight. In the lead-up to the match, Ryan felt he could achieve an easy victory over Ray, stating it was only a warm-up match for him, and a mismatch at that. Come the day of the event though, it quickly became clear that Ryan had strongly underestimated his Latvian opponent. Ryan's relatively tall frame clearly had some issues with cutting the weight necessary for the super match, and Coach Ray handled Ryan without much of an issue, and eventually took the victory 3-0, at times seemingly toying with the Australian. Despite his recent loss, Ryan would soon be offered a match in another one of the most prestigious tournaments around. King of the Table 5 was looking for 2 athletes to compete against one of their in-house genetic freaks, Khaled Jeshel. Firstly, Khaled would arm wrestle Schoolboy in a super match, after which he would go on to face Ryan Bowen. After winning a hard battle versus Schoolboy, Khaled faced Ryan Bowen and was seemingly too fatigued to give the Australian a good fight. Ryan ended up winning the super match and took a worthwhile win in one of the premier arm wrestling tournaments around. Public opinion on Ryan's appearance, though, was, like many times before, divided at best. Many people still wrote Ryan off as someone who over-exaggerated his own ability on the table and was given high-profile matches undeservedly. In September and December of 2022, Ryan appeared in 2 matches of Neil Pickup's Iron House 2. He won a close left-handed match versus James Wall and went on to win a right-handed super match versus Bogdan Stoika, despite Ryan coming into his match with Stoika as a serious underdog. Although controversy and social media attention seemed to follow Ryan wherever and whenever he shared his opinions on all things arm wrestling, he still maintained a good working relationship with a lot of big names within the community. I believe other content creators saw a potential collaboration or rivalry with Ryan as a mutualistic relationship, much like in nature where the oxpecker feeds off ticks stuck on a rhino, which leads to one species ending up tolerating the other. However, it seemed like soon Ryan would overstep some bounds, leading to a consequential falling out with several content creators and tournament organizers within the arm wrestling community. In the world of arm wrestling content creation, one individual stands out as somewhat of a pioneer, Gary Roberts, operating under the banner of his brainchild, ArmTV. Gary became the primary source for numerous arm wrestling matches from the late 90s and early 2000s that you can still enjoy on YouTube today. His archives represent an invaluable treasure trove for anyone delving into the rich history of arm wrestling. Gary, in general, was a supporter of Ryan Bowen's arm wrestling ventures and content creation initiatives. However, as Ryan transitioned into producing videos where he offered commentary and reactions to arm wrestling matches, tensions started to brew. Ryan began incorporating segments of Gary's footage into his videos, at times even showcasing entire matches. This didn't sit well with Gary, prompting him to reach out to Ryan in an effort to have the content removed.
His channel benefits at the expense of using other people's footage.
Interestingly, Ryan firmly maintained that his use of Gary's footage aligned with YouTube's fair use policy, which allowed the clips to exist online. He declined Gary's request to remove the content, sparking a clash between the two figures in the arm wrestling community. Gary, on his side, saw this more as an ethical, personal issue, whereas Bowen seemed to approach it more from a legal standpoint. One positive, though, for fellow content creators was that of course Ryan would have to be okay with others using his footage in a transformative way. Right? In March of 2022, amidst growing online scrutiny towards Ryan Bowen, a YouTube channel named the Arm Wrestling Bible would upload a video called The Delusional Ryan Bowen, basically a compilation video of Ryan's most outlandish claims and the events that followed, often directly contradicting those claims, edited together in a humorous way. The video gained some notoriety within the arm wrestling community, and served as a first introduction to Ryan Bowen as a delusional arm wrestler for many people, a moniker that would stick to this day. Several more episodes would come out in the series during the next months and year, further throwing fuel on what was quickly becoming the proverbial dumpster fire of Ryan's reputation online. Although Ryan was at first quite adversarial towards the series, in more recent times he has seemingly, at least in part, come to accept it for what it is. Ryan had also become a regular part of one of the longest running podcasts in arm wrestling, Neil Pickup's The Fix. Since episode 1, Coach Ray and Ryan Bowen would perform in a sort of co-host role on the weekly podcast, where the trio developed a working relationship and somewhat of a rapport. Unfortunately, it seems like not everything was as easygoing as it seemed on the outside. Apart from rumors and allegations about earlier disagreements between the two, Neil Pickup and Ryan Bowen came to quite a public falling out after the release of the Arm Wars Dark card in early 2023. Without going into too many details, Ryan publicly resented the fact that the main match in the event between Sandris and Devon was advertised as happening live according to public opinion, but in the end was pre-recorded and edited. This jumping on the bandwagon was seen by Neil Pickup, the organizer of Arm Wars, as a public betrayal and proved to be the final straw in their already wavering relationship. In another rather public controversy, Ryan found himself in hot water with another one of the biggest tournament organizers in recent history. Although the exact details have already become somewhat muddied, it seemed like Engin Terzi had hired Ryan to do commentating for his events, as well as aid him in some social media work. Ryan was subsequently seen filming with his cell phone at one of the events, something Engin believed to be a malicious attempt to steal content. Whether true or not, given Ryan's track record, this reaction might be somewhat understandable. However, Ryan maintains he was simply doing his job and filming footage for Engin to use on the event's socials. Ryan also decided to livestream his commentary on many of the biggest arm wrestling events on his YouTube channel, something that always attracted a substantial amount of viewers and undoubtedly some financial benefits. These live streams, although potentially complying entirely with the law, attracted the ire of Engin Terzi, who promptly demanded Ryan stop doing them. Ryan Bowen, as to be expected by now, saw no reason to comply, and by the end completely soured any potential relationship with the Turkish tournament organizer. Having organized several events and super matches, it seemed only natural that Ryan Bowen and by extension, pound for pound, would get involved with one of Australia's biggest and most recent arm wrestling tournaments. The very first Arm Wrestling Entertainment tournament took place in early 2023, and although a couple athletes had to pull out, the event eventually had as a headliner Ryan Bowen vs Matteo Rangi Heta Morris. The two had faced each other multiple times before, and a good matchup could be expected this time. Come match day though, Heta Morris' strength and clearly developing arm wrestling prowess proved to be too much for Ryan, who lost every round. Ryan's earlier falling out with Engin Terzi would unfortunately prove to be a serious disadvantage for the Australian AWE tournament. It seems several athletes had been put under contract, which made it impossible for them to compete in the tournament Ryan was affiliated with. As if to fan the flames even more, in a strange turn of events, it seems like the next AWE, where Ryan will be facing the Indian Mazahir Saidu, is being held on the same date as East vs West 10, an event that is being touted as possibly one of the biggest arm wrestling events ever. As a recent result of a new mindset and change in direction for Ryan's YouTube channel, he decided to get rid of the blue nickname, renaming his channel and sharing plans to change other social media accounts to simply Ryan Bowen. As of late, Ryan has also ramped up the frequency of his short videos, with all of them seemingly covered in a strange filter and a little more experimental in style. Ryan, with relatively little experience in arm wrestling training, decided to find another revenue stream in offering structured training programs. Although credible reviews are hard to come by nowadays, we can look at least one person's opinion on Ryan's methods and training program. In this review, the arm wrestler that enrolled in one of his training programs for $30 a month alleges he recruited Ryan's services around the end of 2020 and had a terrible experience. This review labeled it the worst program ever and says it gave him chronic elbow issues. The reviewer goes on to say, Ryan ignored most of the questions posed to him and says he never personally approached him after his initial skating review. It should be noted, Ryan did eventually reply to this review in kind, stating the claims made were untrue and the person was just out to ruin his reputation. In a truly professional move like no other, Ryan ends the rebuff with, "Go eat a dick. I have an Australian rank 1 title to contend for now." Criticism of Ryan's and by extension pound for pound's training and arm wrestling implements can also be found here and there, referring to below average quality and overpricing. Whether or not these reviews are genuine and on the mark, I cannot say, as I haven't tried any of his implements and services myself. In 2022, Ryan found himself traveling around Europe, clearly showing all the locations he's visiting in his vlog-style videos. He also, during this time, decided he wanted to hire a professional trainer for himself to continue his journey in strength training. However, the training would cost up to $5,000, a sum Ryan apparently needed help to get to, as he started a GoFundMe campaign and asked his viewers and followers to aid him financially. The juxtaposition of him traveling all around Europe while asking for money of his viewers understandably didn't sit well with many people, and in hindsight was bad timing at best and greedy opportunism at worst. In the end, I can't help but approach Ryan Bowen currently with a cautious optimism in regards to his future as an arm wrestler and arm wrestling content creator. His unwavering confidence and drive to succeed within content creation is, at least on a personal level, somewhat of an inspiration. However, his seeming unwillingness to compromise and expert ability to burn bridges is not something I would personally subscribe to. In recent times, Bowen's social media career seems to be doing better than ever, and his passion for arm wrestling, regardless of true motivations, seems to be going strong. If one would approach this as a rising tide lifts all boat type of situations, despite his seemingly many misgivings, I can't help but wish him all the best and hope he continues to grow as a force for good in the arm wrestling community. Because let's face it, despite, or maybe in part, thanks to his status as a living meme, he does have a certain influence within our sport, and I don't think he'll be leaving us anytime soon. Although largely out of the spotlight right now, Arsen Liliev is a name still held in high regard amongst people considered in the know within the arm wrestling community. Often praised for his meteoric rise in the tournament scene and incredible physical evolution, Liliev's career in arm wrestling is certainly as interesting as they come. With many still questioning his departure from the sport many years later and one of the most juicy controversies I have covered so far, it seems like the perfect time to cover the career of this Russian athlete. I am the Arm Historian, and without further ado, this is the rise and fall of Arsen Liliev. Arsen Liliev was born in May of 1987 in Russia, more specifically in the Republic of North Ossetia, Alania. As a child, like many of his peers, Arsen was primarily interested in wrestling and football, as far as sports went. In his local school during breaks, Arsen could often be found arm wrestling with his classmates, something that was a common pastime in the region at the time. At the tender age of 13, Arsen began looking for local arm wrestling clubs and other gyms in his neighborhood, eager to start his own strength journey. At the age of 15 by 2002, Arsen heard of a club near him called Club Daedalus. At Daedalus, he would start his arm wrestling training under the tutelage of Ibrahim Shochiev, a high-caliber arm wrestler in his own right. Shochiev mainly focused on teaching Arsen the basics and rudimentary technical aspects of the sport, but after some time, however, Liliev met someone whose last name had become synonymous with high-level arm wrestling in the region. Mairbek Zoloev was part of a veritable arm wrestling dynasty and would become Arsen's main coach for many years to follow throughout his youth. Mairbek, his brother Kazbek, and two sons, Kazimurat and Spartak, are accomplished arm wrestlers and notorious characters within the competitive scene in Russia and beyond. The two family elders had a deep background in weightlifting, which undoubtedly seeped into their rigorous arm wrestling training methods, something that Arsen seemed happy to adopt. Liliev would not only train with the Zoloev family, but would also maintain strong ties with them throughout his entire arm wrestling career. Arm wrestling club Daedalus was well known for producing champions in the sport and had seemingly found its new golden child in the young Arsen. 2 years after joining an arm wrestling club, Liliev made his competitive debut at the Russian National Championships. He ended up coming in first place in the 70kg category, introducing the arm wrestling world to the young force of nature and proving without a doubt the potential present within this young Russian athlete. In 2005, now age 17, Arsen Liliev entered his first international tournament at the European Championships in Bulgaria. His debut on the global scene proved to be a surprise to everyone in attendance, apart from the team that had been training the young talent, of course. Arsen managed to fight his way to the finals in the 75kg category, eventually losing out to an experienced Svetan Gashevsky. His victory in Russian championships and second place at Europeans at such a young age left a long-lasting impression not only on all arm wrestlers present, but also on his native country's sporting federation. These accomplishments led Liliev to being recruited to the Russian national team and granted him the ability to participate in numerous high-stake tournaments, something he eagerly pursued. 1 year on, now in 2006, Liliev would do even better, this time winning both the Russian Nationals and European Championships in his weight class. Although very much underreported in modern sources, but readily available in contemporary ones, in 2007, Arsen would be faced with a moral dilemma and would, as a consequence of his decision, end up embroiling himself in quite a controversy. Arsen and his team were set to compete in the 2007 European Championships, taking place in northern Sweden. When it was time for the first weigh-in, however, Liliev found out to his consternation that he weighed in at about 2 kilograms over the 70kg category. Not wanting to pull a category up, he decided to instead send one of his slightly lighter teammates to make the second weigh-in, under the guise of being Arsen Liliev. The plan probably would have worked too, were it not for the fact that during the second weigh-in, every athlete would have their picture taken. The pictures of participating athletes were subsequently printed out, laminated, and assigned to each one to correctly identify them. During one of Arsen's matches, one of the referees noticed a discrepancy and immediately notified the rest of the WAF about a picture on Arsen's badge not looking even remotely like Arsen. The World Arm Wrestling Federation concluded that the two accused athletes were acting independently of the Russian Sporting Federation and ultimately decided to let both of them off with a warning, citing they would incur a 2-year ban if something similar happened again. To this day, this remains one of the most audacious and ultimately amusing examples of attempted cheating in professional arm wrestling I've ever come across. Seems like this event also served as a tipping point for Arsen as far as his weight went, as later that year he came in first in the 75 kg class at the World Championships, and from there would start a nearly unbelievable ascendancy throughout the weight classes. During this time, Arsen would also fill out his frame and started to show the first signs of an impressive physique, geared primarily towards arm wrestling. Arsen was also quickly developing a lethally quick and strong top roll, and seemed to throw himself into every hit with reckless abandon, something that would often result in him careening himself from the table. During the 2008 Worlds, he snagged a silver medal on the left hand and won an impressive gold medal on the right hand, now firmly sitting in the 85 kg, or about 190 pounds category. As time went on and slowly marched towards and then into the next decade, it only became more apparent for those keeping a close eye on the Russian Liliev that the man had quickly become a genuine contender for the #1 spot, not only in his own ever-growing weight category, but also as an overall puller. In 2009, he entered the World Championships in Italy as a 90 kg athlete and handily won first place, securing yet another notch on his already impressive resume. With the mounting success and popularity of the supermatch format becoming apparent during the following years throughout the globe, and the financial benefits of these events now too hard to ignore, Arsen focused a lot of his efforts into this direction. One such supermatch took place in August of 2009, when at the Istanbul International Friendship Night, Liliev faced off against the notorious American Travis Bagent. Arsen proceeded to absolutely dominate Bagent and outpowered him every round, easily taking the win that night. Another one of these super matches presented itself to Liliev in 2010, where in Istanbul he would face the GOAT himself, John Brzezinski. Despite Arsen's explosive power, John managed to make the bout a very close one, but ultimately lost the match to the young Russian 3-2. Although arguably somewhat deserved, this match ended up drawing quite a bit of critique towards Liliev, with many people citing false starts and uncalled elbow fouls as the reason he ultimately won, something that would repeat itself frequently throughout the arm wrestler's career. Another funny side note is that Engin Terzi, now one of the biggest tournament organizers around, served as the referee for the match. A year on, in 2011, Liliev would face yet another legend from the West, this time in Todd Hutchings. Although Hutchings came in seemingly confident and prepared, he must have been surprised when Arsen stepped onto the stage and showcased his by now superhuman-looking physique. Liliev's enormous arms, especially compared to the rest of his already impressive frame, were starting to lead a life of their own on various message boards throughout the internet, with many speculating on how he had achieved such massive gains in only a few years. Arsen's incredible power ended up leading to a win versus Hutchings, with the Russian's only losses in the match coming from self-induced elbow fouls, and him ultimately being declared the winner of a very stacked International Arm Fight World Cup. In order to secure more financial stability for himself, something that seemed to have driven a lot of the decisions Liliev made in his career, Liliev had agreed to represent another region within Russia in his sporting endeavors. The city of Samara had approached Arsen with an offer that was seemingly too good to refuse, resulting in him now representing the Volga region. Although one can hardly blame Liliev for pursuing a more profitable lane, this decision drew criticism mainly from local fans and followers of arm wrestling in his home region, and in Russia at large. On the 10th of March 2012, Liliev found himself in the final day of the Russian Championships, participating in the final open category showdown. Winning over Kazimierat Zoloev in the first round, Liliev pulled off the seemingly impossible by beating an imposing Denis Iplenkov in the finals and taking the first place victory. It should be noted that Denis had a hard-fought battle with Andrei Pushkar right before though. In 2012, Arsen Liliev, proving that he was still at the top of the sport, entered the Russian A1 Open tournament and battled his way against some of the top arm wrestlers of the time to a first place in the 110 plus kilogram category and third place in the overall right hand category. Not an easy feat, as Denis Iplenkov ended up winning the tournament and Liliev eventually gave up second place to the legendary Andrei Pushkar. That very same year, Arsen had the opportunity to travel to Brazil to participate in the WAF World Championships. Although he was a heavy favorite in his weight class, Liliev ended up losing in a hard-fought battle against the Bulgarian Krasimir Kostadinov in the finals. Liliev also participated in a PAL arm fight super match in June of that same year, taking on Dmitry Trubin, a match he ultimately ended up winning quite convincingly with a 5-1 victory over Trubin. Arsen participated in many more super matches in the previous and following years and consistently did well, although admittedly they were too numerous to go over in full detail. 1 year on, during the Russian Nationals of 2013, Liliev managed to make it all the way to the finals, but ultimately ended up losing quite convincingly to a monstrous Denis Iplenkov. Later that year, Arsen would once again find himself in hot water with the powers that be. The WAF had been testing a portion of its athletes for performance-enhancing drugs and had, after an investigation, concluded several participants had tested positive at the 2013 European Championships. Amongst a list of 13 athletes that tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs released by the WAF, alongside well-known names like Gennady Krikvinya and Rustam Babayev, Arsen Liliev was also included and subsequently sanctioned by the Federation. A ban of 2 years was doled out to Liliev, which in hindsight seems to have been one of the main motivating factors for the athlete's eventual retirement from the sport in any competitive sense. One of the last official big-scale tournaments that Arsen would compete in was the independent Azov Fortress, held by organizer Alexander Simonov. Arsen competed in this stacked tournament in 2013 and could freely do so because no formal ties existed between Azov Fortress and the WAF. Liliev ended up taking first place in the open weight category, taking home a then practically unprecedented 50,000 rubles, an amount that was then equivalent to about $1,500 when adjusted against inflation. Despite clearly still being part of the elite in arm wrestling, Liliev would soon after announce his retirement from the sport, citing a wish to spend more time on his personal life, and by extension his family and business, although he would remain on the fringes of the tournament scene, something he did by training promising young athletes and attending major tournaments as a coach and spectator. After a long period of all but radio silence from our protagonist Liliev, with a couple of comebacks rumored but never confirmed, more recently in the spring of 2023, Arsen was a guest on one of Engin's live streams, together with Hermes Gasparini and Pavlo Derbedenev. During the interview, the topic of Arsen participating in East vs West came up, which he didn't seem at all adverse to. Although often having cited financial gain as a primary motivating factor, I believe it should be clear by now that we have seldomly come across someone throwing themselves so fully and unabashedly into the sport as Arsen Liliev. After his 10-year career as a professional arm wrestler, Arsen's resume speaks for itself, and finding a high-tier tournament that he hasn't won during this time is not an easy task. Despite a few hiccups and morally ambiguous decisions made by the bulky Russian, at the end of the day, in my opinion, few people embody pure arm wrestling quite like Arsen. We can only hope he decides, like many others have done lately, to return to the competitive scene and show us once again a glimpse of why he became the legend he is now.
I am ready to arm wrestle now. Can I arm wrestle now?
Equal parts confident swagger and tenacious athleticism, Andrew Cobra Rhodes has been around the arm wrestling scene longer than most, becoming an icon within the culture. But how much arm wrestling prowess truly lies behind his exuberance? And what are the ups and downs throughout his career that led him to become the legend he is so widely considered to be now? I am the Arm Historian, and just like before, I'll be your tour guide while we attempt to make brighter the ever-growing legacy of one of arm wrestling's most enigmatic athletes and discuss the rise and fall of Andrew Cobra Rhodes. Andrew Rhodes was born in 1965 to two hard-working parents and was preceded by his three older sisters. Andrew's father ran a dry cleaning business and would sometimes take his son along on deliveries, as evidenced from one of Andrew's earlier memories, taking in the smell of dry cleaner in his dad's van at the age of 4.
I used to deliver back then in '60s. I remember when I was 4 or 5 years old driving in his delivery vans. and the smell of the dry cleaning. But yeah, my dad was a hard-working man, real loving man, real solid dude.
By the time Andrew was a young teenager, aged 11, he first discovered arm wrestling, competing with other children at his school. 3 years later, it seems like Andrew had become known as the arm wrestling kid in his school, pointing to quite the obsession with the sport, even from such a young age. By this time, the youngster was taking on high school coaches, and sometimes even arm wrestled for money with out-of-school kids. During the early 80s, Andrew was well and truly hooked on the sport and sought out training partners that would help him reach his full potential. Mike Petrarca was a well-established arm wrestler that would frequently organize arm wrestling practices around Rhode Island, welcoming people of every level of proficiency in the sport. The young Andrew fit right in and started quickly improving, all the while joining his training partners at several local and national tournaments and doing really well at them. From an early age, it became quite clear that Andrew preferred a hand-dominant technique on the table, something he would develop even further during the rest of his career. His nickname, Cobra, a moniker he still proudly wears to this day, seemingly was given to him because of the visual appearance of his arm wrestling style. As an extension of that, one of the things Andrew would become known for was the exploding hand technique. This awesomely named technique is not so much one single move, but rather a mindset, or philosophy if you will, while arm wrestling, at least according to Cobra himself.
So is it fair to say that exploding hand technique is both philosophy and making that philosophy appear on the table? It's not just a move.
Yeah. You got it, Uncle John.
One infamous incident, and perhaps even the reason why the technique was named the exploding hand technique, happened when Andrew faced the Latvian Jānis Amelins and nearly split his hand in two while applying the move.
That's my exploding hand technique. Ask Jānis. Winner!
In 1986, production commenced on the arm wrestling themed movie Over the Top, starring Sylvester Stallone. Cobra, even at such a young age and this early in his career, got hired as a consultant for the arm wrestling techniques featured during the matches in the movie, as well as hired as an actor, portraying a referee for the final match.
Sly Stallone was doing a film about arm wrestling, and they chose me as one of the athletes to work with his technique. And after working with him, he threw me the little part as a referee in the final two matches of the film.
During the latter part of the 1980s, now in his early 20s, Cobra would seemingly ramp up his obsession and prowess for the sport to an even bigger degree, the kind of unbridled commitment one would expect to see from a young talented man attempting to make a name for himself. It appears he did just that by doing consistently well at the AAA Nationals, a tournament that would have both sit-down and stand-up editions, and functioned as one of the main tests of arm wrestling in North America at the time. Cobra would get podium positions at these tournaments even well into the 90s, getting a first-place finish at the 89, 91, and 1993 editions. Super Bras de Fer was a huge televised invitation-only arm wrestling event held in 1991 in France. In all likelihood, the event was designed to emulate the success of the massively popular Over the Top tournament. Cobra was one of a select group of pullers invited to the event and ended up taking first in the 80 kg category and fourth in the overalls. One funny detail regarding this tournament is that a prize was also awarded to the athletes that put on the best show while arm wrestling, something Cobra obviously took as a challenge. This serves as a clear early example of Andrew's exuberance and showmanship on the table. The story of this tournament is extremely interesting in its own right and probably deserves a separate video in the future. Now back to Cobra. In 1990, 92 and 93, Andrew competed in the always stacked Yukon Jack tournaments and got a second, first and third place respectively.
Do you have the strength? Do you have the guts? Do you have the pride? Do you have what it takes to be a part of Yukon Jack Mania?
During this time, Cobra also didn't shy away from competing at the highest level internationally, getting several first-place finishes at the WAF Worlds, and becoming the de facto poster boy of successful international American pullers, next to John Brzezinski, of course. In 1998, Cobra entered and won two big tournaments with a serious prize payout. First in the second edition of the main event, and after that also taking a first-place victory in the Forza Tropical Championships held in Curacao. This last tournament became quite infamous for at one point experiencing a blackout, leading to athletes having to arm wrestle, illuminated by flashlights, and having a small but experienced athlete turnout, with John Brzezink's wife even taking a first place and substantial payout by default. To top off the decade, also in '99, Cobra tried his hand yet again at the WAF Worlds and garnered another first place victory, becoming world champion yet again. That year, at the very same tournament, taking place in Russia, Cobra also absolutely dominated the competition in the overall class, even at such a relatively low weight. A lot of people will point to this period in time as being Andrew Cobra Rhodes' absolute peak in the sport of arm wrestling. When the new millennium rolled around, Andrew would continue to distinguish himself as one of the top arm wrestlers around by winning the Arnold Classic in 2000 and snagging a third place in the 2001 edition. He also managed to take the podium at the famous 2000 Petaluma World Wrist Wrestling Championship with a second place in the lightweights and third place in the middleweights. In 2000, Cobra also participated in the Harley Pulls, a notorious arm wrestling tournament with a Harley bike on the line. He lost out in the overall finals that day versus John Brzezinski and walked away with a second place and an extra $500. He would go on to compete in many more Harley Pulls after this throughout the next decade and consistently did really well, even winning the coveted bike in the 2008 edition. Despite having become a mainstay of the American as well as the international arm wrestling world by now, Cobra himself still felt somewhat like an outsider. Later, in interviews, he would talk about never having been fully accepted by a lot of heavily entrenched people in the community during the early parts of his career. To a degree, this might have affected his mentality and might be part of what ultimately led to a mindset of extreme tenacity in having to prove himself. He would go on to refer to himself as somewhat of a fly in the milk, perhaps in part because of the obvious lack of diversity and representation at the highest level of our sport.
I was a fly in the milk.
Okay.
At a different time.
I'm with you.
And a lot of folks weren't shy about letting you know that, but I love my parents already. I was already in the game.
2001 would prove to be a pivotal moment in Andrew's arm wrestling career though. He would become involved in a major car accident, resulting in serious bodily injuries. Cobra would go on to talk about this incident at length during several interviews and stresses not only the physical toll it took on his body, but also the serious mental strain he experienced as a result. Although somewhat disputed by the great results he still managed to get after this, a lot of people will say Cobra never again reached the same peak in arm wrestling as he did before the accident. Andrew's arm wrestling career, however, was far from over. He continued to remain somewhat active on the peripheries, but came out and showed the world he was still relevant at the elite level by doing consistently well at big tournaments between 2008 and 2013. He podiumed at the 2007 Ruler of the Nation tournament and even entered 4 more editions of the Arnold Classic, snagging a first place in the 80kg division in 2013. Cobra also became somewhat of a mainstay of the UAL, competing in their tournaments as well as super matches. In 2010, he also ventured back to the prestigious WAF Worlds and earned himself a first place victory in the 80kg Masters division. During the next years, and well and truly into the 2010s now, Andrew became a mainstay of the Armoire Super Series, facing off against many different opponents. Although he didn't always walk away with the win, audiences were treated to some of the most all-in arm wrestling matches in existence. Cobra never shied away from pulling in what looked to be some of the most uncomfortable positions on the table imaginable. This not only showed he could still hang with some of the more accomplished pullers around, but that his showmanship was still a hotly searched after commodity in any competitive arm wrestling event. Now in 2013, the PAL, run by Igor Mazurenko, was trying to solidify its foothold in the North American arm wrestling scene. One point of attack was making Cobra the official face of the organization, probably wanting to take advantage of the fact that Cobra was still for many one of the most recognizable people in our sport. However, not long after, now in 2014, Rhodes would perhaps experience new heights as far as exposure towards the world at large. A new reality TV show revolving completely around arm wrestling and its athletes was set to debut on AMC. Cobra's outgoing and somewhat eccentric character, as well as his previous on-screen experience, looked to be the perfect recipe for a reality TV show.
It's really been simple. I mean, I've been in the business since the early 80s, you know, and as far as show business, however you want to put it, but I I found this to be the easiest thing I've ever done because I've just been myself. There's no lines to read, there's no markers or placements or anything. It's just raw. Just be yourself. You can't mess that up.
If you want to learn more about Game of Arms and Cobra's role in it, be sure to take a look at my video on the topic. Cobra is great in the show and it's an entertaining watch all around. From 2014 onwards, in part because of the connections and impression he had made during Game of Arms, Cobra started participating in and became an integral part of the World Arm Wrestling League. The man proved to be a crowd favorite on the MC show 1 year earlier, something that would be no different in this league. Rhodes featured prominently in several super matches in the league and would do relatively well in both the tournament and super match era. If you want to know more about the WAL and its inception, check out my video on the topic. With arm wrestling seeing a potentially unprecedented growth in the wake of the COVID pandemic, it seems Cobra Rhodes too would heed the call of competitive arm wrestling once again. After dipping his toe in the local arm wrestling scene and trying to shake the rust off, an opportunity presented itself to pull on the big stage. In November of 2022, Cobra was set to face the Turkish arm wrestler Haydar Gildil in a Legend Super match at East vs West 5. While Andrew put up quite a fight in the early part of the match, it soon became apparent that the strength gap was too big to overcome, and Haydar comfortably took the match. While this seems to have somewhat derailed Andrew's return to the competitive scene, he would later feature prominently in a later edition of East vs West. This time appearing off the table and more in a hosting capacity, conducting athlete interviews, participating in the press conference, and all around helping with the goings-on at the event. Personally, I'd love to see Cobra stick around for many years to come, in whatever capacity he deems possible for himself. Despite being in the public eye as much as he was throughout his arm wrestling career, Cobra's legacy remains largely controversy-free, not an easy feat especially compared to some other subjects of the Rise and Fall series. One thing that stood out especially to me was the fact that while I was doing research for this video, I heard nothing but good things from Cobra's peers in the sport. In fact, when talking to other arm wrestlers and friends of Cobra, I heard anecdote after anecdote of him being a stand-up guy and someone they truly looked up to in the sport. One such story that I feel serves as a good illustration of Cobra's character comes courtesy of Jody Williams, who was eager to show me a treasured gift he received from Cobra. Jody was dealing with a very tragic personal loss at the time and happened to run into Cobra at a local tournament. When Jody wasn't looking, Rhodes handed his 1999 WAF Worlds gold medal to Jody's wife and said to her, "Tell your husband to hold on to this." The next day, while driving to the airport, Jody's wife told him about what had happened and showed him the gifted medal. Even in my own limited interactions I've had with Andrew Cobra Rhodes, he's been nothing less than supportive and extremely generous with his time. Andrew Cobra Rhodes is a name that has become synonymous with not only arm wrestling, but in a way has become synonymous with what it means to be an arm wrestler. I'm sure I failed to include several accomplishments and significant moments in the man's arm wrestling life, but believe that I have clearly illustrated that he has won basically every title under the sun. He's someone who, throughout his long and storied career in the sport, has, as far as I can tell, never relented in being unapologetically himself on and off the table. Despite facing setbacks, his no-holds-barred spirit on the table and willingness to help others never faltered, something that served to make Andrew Cobra Rhodes, in this humble arm's opinion, one of the most respected and shining symbols of our modest sport. If you watched this video in its entirety, it means you either fell asleep to my videos, or you must be a real supporter of the arm historian. In either case, thank you, and thanks to all the wonderful Armenians and finger folks for going the extra mile. If you have a minute or two more to spare, consider giving me some of that sweet interaction in the form of a like, a sub, and or a comment. Arm historian, out.